Am I your brother, now and always?
Now and always.
My sword is yours, in victory and defeat, from this day until my last day.
Theon Greyjoy, a favourite of some, hated by others, yet a character unquestionably fascinating from a psychological perspective. A man we've seen go by many names, from Theon to Hostage to Prince of Winterfell to Reek, Turncloak, the Ghost of Winterfell. I am a psychotherapist, and like I have made many videos on other characters from the A Song of Ice and Fire books, although we may touch on the TV version of Theon a little, it's possible, but we're mostly going to focus on the books because that is the richest, most interesting material, and I hope we can bridge the gap between empathy and criticism, where we can empathise without excusing his actions and criticise them without losing empathy. Both can coexist. Quick disclaimer before we begin, it is obviously absurd to analyse someone in a video like this. For one, they are fictional, and that obviously skews most things, but secondly, we can't talk to Theon, we can't ask him questions, gauge his responses, meaning we at points will have to speculate a lot more than a therapist would do in reality with a real patient, and in that sense this will then inevitably be a flawed pursuit. But I still think a very meaningful, worthwhile one for a lot of great reasons that hopefully make for a great video. Enough of that though, let's get into Theon's head. It's time we begin this video the way all things must begin, with a cool train. Naturally, we're going first to childhood, only there's not actually that much evidence here to work from. What we know is the culture of the Islands, and I think this culture will pervade a lot of the things we have to say about Theon. It will be a constant factor, even if it's not one this video I'm going to bring up too much. It's not going to be the focus, obviously, but you know, this is an island of people in the weird position of being very proud of their strength, their independence, their freedom to raid and pillage wherever they like. That's kind of their classic history, and doing so successfully is a mark of glory for them. And at the same time, those days are pretty much gone. The Islands is a small, mostly forgotten part of Westeros that lacks fertile lands, that lacks much power. The strength is in ships, but that means they miss out on a lot of what goes on in the centre of the land. And then compared to a lot of the other great houses, they end up feeling, I think, near the bottom of the very social hierarchy they try to insist they are separate from, idealising a past that they can then inevitably never live up to. No longer may we ride the wind with fire and sword, taking what we want. Now, we scratch in the ground and toss lines in the sea like other men, and count ourselves lucky if we have salt cod and porridge enough to get us through winter. A fact made plain by Theon's father, Balon Greyjoy. He attempted to stoke a rebellion and declare the Iron Islands independent from the crown, only to fail terribly and be forced to kneel. Well, not fail terribly, but you get the point. I think we see this conflict in Theon quite a lot. On the one hand, very proud to be a Greyjoy, very keen to align himself with all the imagined benefits he's entitled to, and on the other hand, he half looks down on it. It's a little embarrassing, his culture. The small island stuck living in the past. Theon is a man caught between two cultures, and the result is he struggles to know what to think of either. Adds to that, the hierarchy of the Ironborn themselves are less set in stone. The same feudalism does exist, but also with a lot of ideas about men being the ones that make the king, about needing to prove your worth, about being the captain of your own ship, rather than it being so overtly a birthright. It's a slightly murkier ground between the two, which in a lot of ways is a positive, but for a child like Theon who does still technically inherit that birthright, or is seen as supposed to inherit it, that's now a lot of added pressure, because you have to prove you're worthy to everyone, prove you're worthy of the thing you were born for. The drowned god makes men. Old King Uren Redhand has once said, thousands of years ago, but it's men who make crowns. So we've got a lot of conflicted feelings about his home, we've got an intense pressure to be strong, that the idea of strength pervades much of the Ironborn. And then thirdly, when they're standing with the rest of Westeros, makes it hard to live up to that ideal of strength and independence and all their old idealised ways. I think it's fairly likely the culture here might either flip that into an entitlement that they deserve more, they demand more, or else it might breed a lot of insecurity about your own social standing. Arguably both of those things. And I think this idea is quite relatable for a lot of young men, even nowadays, a sense of pressure to live up to an ideal that no longer quite fits the modern world, and a sense of failure or insecurity if you're not managing that. I'm mainly pointing out that Balon Greyjoy, Theon's father, struggles with many of the same insecurities we will see in Theon. The need to prove strength, to mask weakness and insecurity. And a lot of this may have come as a result of the failed rebellion for Balon, after which Theon didn't see Balon again, so you couldn't then really argue too much of it has been pressed onto Theon, but I would imagine some of these insecurities were already present in Balon before the rebellion, before he lost Theon, and as a result may have been projected onto Theon from an early age. We will talk more about Balon later, but the other thing we know of Theon's childhood is that he had two older brothers who would regularly beat him. It's hard to say much concrete about this because we aren't really given any evidence other than just that fact, but it would suggest a level of projecting their own weaknesses onto Theon, an experience of Theon feeling weak and helpless and lesser in comparison to them. You have to be strong as an Iron Islander. But here are two brothers constantly pressing him to feel the reverse of that, making that physically, painfully clear. That earned him the worst thrashing he had ever had at Winterfell, though it was almost tender compared to the beatings his brother used to give him back on Pike. And then the rebellion happens. Both of Theon's brothers are killed while he is 10 years old. I don't know what he feels about this. The only real mentions of his brothers Rodrik and Maron are that he dislikes them for their obvious cruelty. Chiefly, he remembered Rodrik's drunken cuffs and Maron's cruel japes and endless lies. It's hard to know a lot of his feelings about this event, because the crucial thing is Theon is taken as a hostage, or a ward, I should say. In order to make sure Balon doesn't try anything funny again, Ned Stark takes this 10-year-old Theon home to live with him as a threat. If you step out of line, Balon, I will execute your only surviving male heir. Which, I suppose we kind of know that about Theon's brothers. That Theon suddenly becoming the sole surviving male heir, who is then kept at Winterfell for 9 years, no contact with his family, just left to stew on the fact he is the heir now. Especially when he is surrounded by Starks, all entitled to things he's not allowed. I think, of course, he would then ruminate on the Seastone chair. I mean, he of course does have a sister Asha, named Yara in the show, but I don't think a young Theon factors her that much into discussion. And to be honest, considering how important a character Asha is in the books, I don't think there's a huge amount I can say about her in relation to Theon, apart from kind of the obvious points that we can bring up later. But the second, more obvious thing about this rebellion is that it would be very, very difficult for Theon to grieve. If a part of him was upset about the death of his brothers, even if it's a very small part of him, it would be difficult for him to explore that miles away from anyone who knows anything about his loss, apart from some of the people who played a hand in causing it. That's not the most inviting environment to try and process grief, or even really think about your family at all. There's not much to suggest Theon does ever think of his father, or his sister, or his mother. The more Greyjoy you see him in Winterfell, the more you're a reminder of their rebellion, their treachery, your family's failure. I mean, I could be wrong, but I'm fairly sure there's no mention of Theon ever writing to his father, or his sister, or mother, or anyone while he's in Winterfell. Maybe that's not the done thing as a ward, I assume it's not the done thing, but I'm also willing to bet if Theon really pressed Eddard, said he really wanted to do that, Eddard probably would have granted it, would have allowed some contact. So can we then theorise that Theon didn't want that, wasn't really interested in exploring his feelings about his family? I don't know if he didn't want it or wasn't interested exactly, but I don't think it would have been the forefront of his mind. I don't think that's a can of worms he would want to open within himself until it came to the possibility of maybe claiming his birthright. The third point to build on this idea of grief is that the rebellion would have been traumatic to Theon, and grief or not, there's definitely feelings there worth processing. I'm sure there is a quote somewhere of him having nightmares about it, but I've struggled to find where that is. But Robert Baratheon's forces stormed the castle, stormed Pike. Theon might have been a child of 10 who took no part in the fighting, but he still would have witnessed a lot. He would have seen the fire, heard the screams, possibly seen countless people he knows slain, and just been terrified for his life as he heard this army getting closer and closer and louder and louder. This was Theon's home, his big symbol of safety and security, being totally invaded by people he'd never seen before. How might that rock a child's sense of safety? You know? And lastly, I would imagine Theon might feel abandoned by his father. Balon, of course, had no choice. On one level, even a 10-year-old Theon might understand that, but consciously understanding and subconsciously feeling are two different things. Whatever he might understand, he might also feel, did my father just give me away? Couldn't he have fought harder to keep me? Couldn't he have bargained anything else? Why didn't he protect me? Why did he let me go? I think this event might leave Theon again feeling more conflicted about his Greyjoy identity, because it has been kind of proven weak, or what he would see as weak, I think. Being a Greyjoy, everything I've associated with that, everything it means couldn't protect me, and yeah, feelings of abandonment as well. In a child's mind, I think this would give rise to a lot of difficult thoughts, such as, does my father actually love me? Does he want me? And if Balon was already previously quite cold or distant towards Theon, which we have no evidence for other than that we're never shown any evidence of any warm feelings or warm memories between them. If that was the case, I think that would, exacerbate this feeling. Theon's mother, of course, fits somewhere into this picture, but I have no idea where. Again, there is literally no evidence I can find about his mother. Considering Theon's attitude towards women, it would be interesting to know more about her, but I think the only dialogue we have in relation to his mum is this exchange with his uncle Aeron. Will I find my sister and Lady Mother at Pike? You will not. Your mother dwells on Harlaw with her own sister. It is less raw there, and her cough troubles her. Your sister has taken Blackwind to Great Wick, with messages from your lord father. She will return ere long, you may be sure. Theon did not need to be told that Blackwind was Usher's longship. He had not seen his sister in 10 years, but that much he knew of her. Odd that she would call it that, when Robb Stark had a wolf named Greywind. Stark is grey, and Greyjoy's black, he murmured, smiling. But it seems we're both windy. I would hazard a guess Theon's mother wasn't afforded much authority. She is not a salt wife, but this classic Iron Island tradition of salt wives, women captured during raids that you basically keep for sex alongside your real wife, your rock wife. I would imagine the fact that tradition still somewhat exists suggests a lack of respect for even rock wives, for women as a whole, with Theon's sister Usher perhaps being an exception precisely because she does all the things they often associate with men, and even she still has a lot to deal with. So we could say that, and we could speculate a little further and say it's interesting Theon doesn't ask how his mother is. You know, he's been told she has a cough. Is she okay? Is she ill? Is she dying? Does she ever ask of me? Theon does ask the original question if he will see his mother and sister, but he also does move on to other matters pretty abruptly. Did he then lack closeness to his mum before he was taken as a ward? Or did he suppress a lot of it in an effort to seem tougher? Or has he missed her so much for all of this time that it's not a box of feelings he wants to open? I don't know, but there are questions worth raising for you to think about. The only other things I can think to say about his family are obviously that Euron Greyjoy is his uncle, which could mean a lot, but I'm not really sure how much contact Theon has had with Euron. I'd like, if someone does know, for them to be able to comment that. He's not someone Theon thinks about, expresses really any memories about, so I don't think it's really worth unpacking everything Euron is in relation to Theon. There's perhaps a little bit we could say about Aeron, but I feel like all of that stuff is kind of for their own video, for the kind of the psychology of them as siblings, of Euron, of Balon, of Aeron. I don't think there's too much we can say here. So for now, let's turn our curiosity towards the Theon that we actually meet at the beginning of the books. Let's see how a lot of these child influences may manifest in him. And speaking of curiosity, today the delivery man knocked on my door and gave me this massive book. Yes, This video is sponsored by Hungry Minds, the creative studio and publishing house behind perhaps the coolest thing I've ever seen. The book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization. Look at this. For thousands of years, everything humanity has become was shaped by our desire for discovery and growth, and while that has often led to tragic consequences, I think it's also what makes humanity so beautiful, because that's our creativity and our passion. And to have this book charting all of the greatest inventions and discoveries of our history, like it's a guidebook for rebuilding civilization and everything that makes it wonderful, that makes for a fascinating read, complete with 200 different handcrafted illustrations. Mirrors! How the hell do mirrors work? This book is filled with the answers to those kind of questions. In very succinct few paragraphs of text, this page on mirrors explains how they work, how you make them, what they mean to us and some of their symbolism. I hope you can hear my enthusiasm. It's a giant tome-like book with high quality paper that is not only packed with interesting knowledge, not only has beautiful illustrations, but for me, I think it's the passion behind this book that makes it feel not like just an encyclopedia of inventions, but like a deeply sincere tribute to humanity as a whole. That's what I feel, anyway. It reminds me, for all the darkness of the world, just how wonderful civilization truly is. And so if this book interests you, or the others they have like it, Hungry Minds has also released the last book, The Diary of an Earthling Recording the End of Humanity, or you can pre-order the Freeman Codex, an elaborate book of riddles and hidden messages 13 years in the making, or the Black Book, celebrating all the fascinating inventions of history that never made it big or never came to fruition, as though they actually changed the world. I find that such a cool idea. I find Hungry Minds such a cool company, so if you're interested, click the link in the description and pinned comment, or scan the QR code, or use the code LittleTree10 to get 10% off your order, and to get your own massive, beautifully crafted tome that you too can slam down on a coffee table for dramatic effect. Hungry Minds. So, Theon is 19 when we meet him in the first book, A Game of Thrones, and the aspect of his character we are very immediately shown from the beginning is his cockiness, his bragging, his private smirking indifference towards the world. Here are a few quotes. Theon was a lean, dark youth of 19 who found everything amusing. No doubt he was smiling. He smiled a lot, as if the world were a secret joke that only he was clever enough to understand. She studied Theon Greyjoy's sly smile, wondering what it meant. That young man had a way of looking as though he knew some secret jest that only he was privy to. Catelyn had never liked it. The insecurity here is both obvious and entirely unsurprising. This is a kid who is basically a hostage with the Starks. Did not choose to go here. His father was defeated in battle, partly by Eddard Stark. On top of everything else we hinted in the last section, Theon might feel his family has been shamed, his security has been stripped away, his freedom has been made conditional, and he is then positioned in this awkward place where he's almost family to the Starks. In a way, being treated like a hostage would be easier, less pleasant, but more straightforward, because then he would know what to think about them and where to position his sense of identity. To go, I am a Greyjoy, I am proud of it, I am a hostage, I will endure this imprisonment with a heroic defiance and trust that a day will come when my family welcomes me home for it. But no, Eddard Stark makes an effort to treat him like family, to raise him with kindness and care. There are a lot of quotes from Theon that suggest he thinks warmly on Eddard Stark, or more warmly than he actually lets on to himself. However, it is never without the distance either. The awareness Eddard is supposed to execute him if Balon ever steps out of line. The ominous sense Theon's life hangs in the balance. The ominous awareness that Eddard Stark is a guy who invaded his home and killed a lot of the Ironborn. Although I can't actually remember if Eddard is the one who invades Pike. It might not be his forces specifically that did that, but the point still remains. Lord Eddard had raised him among his own children, but Theon had never been one of them. The whole castle, from Lady Stark to the lowliest kitchen scullion, knew he was a hostage to his father's good behaviour and treated him accordingly. Even the bastard Jon Snow had been accorded more honour than he had. Lord Eddard had tried to play the father from time to time, but to Theon he had always remained the man who brought bloods and fire to Pike, and taken him from his home. As a boy, he had lived in fear of Stark's stern face and great dark sword. His lady wife was, if anything, even more distant and suspicious. Now, Would Eddard have executed Theon if it ever came to that? I'm doubtful. However, there is still the awareness that's what he's supposed to do, and Theon might fear it regardless. The fact Theon is the one charged with carrying Eddard's greatsword Ice for any executions, symbolically that says a lot about the tension here. And from Ned's perspective, for all his kindness, for all the warmth he might want to impress on Theon, to believe he is a young boy who can be very different from Balon, it would also still be hard not to remain at least fairly distant, because how can you let yourself grow too close to a boy that you may one day be charged with executing? Whether or not Eddard would do that, I don't think for certain he can rule it out. I think a part of his mind might worry he would have to do this, and that would make it hard to feel too much affection. And from Theon's perspective, how do you ever entirely trust him? I suspect he does feel technically a lot of love from Eddard, but it still feels very conditional love. That this isn't an experience for Theon of unconditional love, of unconditional affection. So, with all of this in mind, how do you cope with it? The sense of powerlessness, the humiliation, the distance, the shame, the inability to process a lot of conflicted feelings. Most of all, the loneliness as this sole Greyjoy in a strange wintry land of Starks. The first thing Theon does to cope is to try to be a Stark. I imagine we would have seen a lot more of this when he was closer towards the age 10 than how he is now at 19, but if it's easier to just not think too much about your family and your home, then I think you would try your best to identify with this one, with the only other one around. You would try to belong, try to win the approval of this father figure whose love has felt conditional. If I try harder, maybe I can earn it, maybe then I will feel fully accepted, maybe I won't feel so alone. And we will talk later about Theon's often very palpable desire for approval from father figures. A lot of his life he has lacked a sufficient father figure, we can understand this, but secondly, that attempt to try and belong is also very painful, trying really hard to fit in, to earn approval and a sense of belonging, while at the same time constantly reminded of Eddard's greatsword, or the fact that you're a Greyjoy, or the fact Eddard does continue to seem distant compared to how he is with his own children. Most interestingly, of the fact you don't have any fitting friends your own age. I mean, I imagine there are probably people Theon's age at Winterfell, but they would all be like members of the guard or servants or something. It's that, or it's the Stark children who are all a lot younger than Theon. So you're forced to either try and fit in with people literally below your social standing in a way Theon might take as humiliating, or else try to fit in with children, which is also perhaps kind of humiliating on one level. I mean, imagine being 19 years old. That's Theon's age at the start of this book. Imagine being 19 trying to hang around with someone aged 14. Imagine even more, arriving at Winterfell aged 10 and making friends with a 5-year-old. Sure, those more older brother mentor friendships exist, but Robb is the one who's seen to have kind of power and status as the male heir. And when this is your only friend, I think in the context of all of that, smirking and joking and acting like you take nothing serious is a very obvious defense you might adopt to the fact you don't quite feel able to belong. A very sensible one, because admitting you care, admitting you're desperate for acceptance, only to still feel out of place, that opens you up to so much more vulnerability. There are so many different insecurities Theon might want to mask, and cynicism, indifference, joking, they are often a very good defense. I mean, if everything is a joke, nothing can stick to you. You're like liquid. But even better, you're afforded some means to mock others and project back. What if someone else can be the outsider? Someone else be the humiliated one, the shamed one? But let's talk about age for a moment longer. There's that bit in the first book where Robb and Joffrey are sparring in the yards that I love. Joffrey moved into the sunlight in response to Roderick's summons. His hair shone like spun gold. He looks bored. "This is a game for children, Sir Roderick." Theon Greyjoy gave a sudden bark of laughter. "You are children," he said derisively. I highlight this example because this is a good way to shore up his sense of power, his social standing, his security. He can be the eldest, the most experienced. The fact he is so much the oldest and yet still bottom of the pecking order would hurt, but it can still be used to project, and also it is kind of true. When Theon acts above the others and mocks them as children, he kind of has a point. It's not just his internal world here. But Theon does very much see Bran, Rickon, Arya as children to mock, to have no interest in. As I've kind of hinted, that's intriguing, because if Theon wanted to play the older, wiser adult, he might take an interest in being like a father figure or an older brother to them. He might take pains to teach or advise them on things, but the fact he doesn't suggests instead projecting his insecurity onto them. Similarly, despite Theon and Jon having a lot in common, I mean, hell, they could both bond over the fact they find Catelyn Stark cold towards them. Instead, they're both sort of rivals. Theon dislikes him because he wants Jon to introject and hold all of these othered, insecure feelings that Theon feels deep down about himself. The bastard was a sullen boy, quick to sense a slight, jealous of Theon's high birth and Robb's regard for him. Can you feel just a tad bit of projection in that quote? You know, Jon being the one quick to sense a slight? As much as Theon does smirk in response to everything, it's also very easy to insult him too. Theon is also very jealous of Robb's regard for Jon. And also, you know, what better way for Theon to fit in than to be the best friend of Robb Stark? Sure, the guy is 5 years younger, but he's still the heir of Winterfell. He's still the main guy here. I mean, apart from Eddard, obviously, but you know, that main guy among the children. What better way to earn Eddard's approval as well than to become Robb's indispensable friend? I mean, Eddard made friends with Robert Baratheon at the Eyrie, so he would understand this, surely. As such, create an in-group with you and Robb, and then put the others in an out-group. Jon because he's the bastard, Bran, Rickon, Arya because they're too young, Sansa also too young, but Sansa he also has vague fantasies of marrying in order to very much become a Stark. Theon could have tightened his grip on Winterfell by marrying one of them. Sansa was a pretty little thing too, and by now likely even ripe for bedding. Sansa was the pretty one. He remembered a time when he had thought that Lord Eddard Stark might marry him to Sansa and claim him for a son, but that had only been a child's fancy. I don't think there's any actual affection or closeness here. I've made a video about Sansa already. It's highly unlikely she'd have had any interest in Theon, nor Theon really in her, besides her being this object that can make him more Stark-like, more able to belong. Anyway, the point is we end up with a bit of a not love triangle, more friend triangle, where Jon is always telling Robb Theon is an arse, and Theon likewise is always putting Jon down. And the thing worth mentioning here in relation to Robb and their friendship is that Theon casts himself as Robb's most trusted ally. I mean, of course he does. I can't be the leader among the kids at Winterfell because I am a Greyjoy. He allows Robb to take the leader role at Winterfell, but I can be the loyal sergeant. I can appoint myself second in command by very loudly expressing my loyalty. You see this kind of thing with kids a lot. I mean, here's an example I remember from when I worked in schools. The kids must have been about 6 years old, but they basically had to vote on a group leader for an activities day. And there was one kid very loudly demanding people vote for him. Very, very keen to be the leader, but he didn't get, I don't think, any votes. Maybe one, maybe two, but really not many. It was another kid that swept the boards, and that could be humiliating, right? Well, instead of being devastated, he just immediately started calling out everything the leader said to do. Like, right, the leader said to line up. Come on, everyone, line up. He's the leader. He says what you do. I'm gonna enforce it. It's very sweet to see that play out. You kind of decide, well, I'm not a rival. I have allowed them to take that position. If I choose to be loyal to them, if that's my decision, then I don't have to feel the same level of rejection, you know? It's less humiliating to be 5 years older than Robb and yet below him in the pecking order if you just present yourself as someone choosing to take up that role. And we see this much more when Robb becomes Lord of Winterfell and King in the North. Theon is very, very vocal in his support on everything, constantly making his position very obvious, constantly egging Robb on, constantly bigging him up. Theon at times almost feels like his hype man. Theon thinks I should call the banners, Robb said. If your father dies, Theon said, Robb will be Lord of Winterfell. Lord Frey would be a fool to try and bar our way, Theon Greyjoy said with his customary easy confidence. We have 5 times his numbers. You can take the twins if you need to, Robb. Kill him, Robb, Theon Greyjoy urged. Take his head off. Kneel before the king, Lannister, Theon Greyjoy shouted. You know, no one is more loyal than me. See that, everyone? I'm Robb's closest companion. Robb values my advice. It's very, very sweet. People are often confused why Rob is such good friends with someone who can seem such a pompous ass. But again, Theon was 10 when Rob was 5. There still would have been a lot about Theon that seemed cool when he's that much older. And his passionate loyalty is touching, and also I think Theon would have genuinely been a welcome advisor. Whilst not the most politically astute, Theon is tactically very smart and very cunning, and also he might be someone of, not necessarily an advisor, but a point of knowledge about sex. At least I think. We only really get this one quote. 2 serving wenches stood beneath the sign of the smoking log, the local alehouse. When Theon Greyjoy called out to them, the younger girl turned red and covered her face. Theon spurred his mount to move up beside Rob. "Sweet Kyra," he said with a laugh. "She squirms like a weasel in the bed. But say a word to her on the street, and she blushes pink as a maid. Did I ever tell you about the night that she and Bessa—" "Not where my brother can hear, Theon," Rob warned him, with a glance at Bran. I suppose more bragger, really. Theon is no doubt keen to brag about all his exploits as the older, more experienced child, and I might be wrong, but I do get the impression Rob is normally interested in this. Rob may be 5 years younger, maybe not yet an age looking for relationships, or even considering his honour, wanting to seek out sex at all. But still likely a part of him curious about it, likely keen to hear from Theon what it's like. Being a good friend to Rob is the best thing Theon has while living at Winterfell, and then it genuinely affords him a place of honour when you do become a trusted confidant to the king in the north. Suddenly, at least on one level, you can feel above Roose Bolton and Great John Umber and the Karstarks. You know, does Theon now get to feel more Stark than the Karstarks? And in case it wasn't already obvious, we get this Book 5 quote to emphasise that Theon indeed wants to be a Stark. Now answer my question. Why do you love the Starks? Theon put a gloved hand against a pillar. I wanted to be one of them. Before we move to the next point, I just want to add all these descriptions of Theon always smiling. We shouldn't just write that off as insecurity. When it comes to most human behaviour, chalking it all down as simply one thing rather than multiple, often contradictory ideas is a mistake. What if all this smiling is also because Theon is actually quite happy deep down at Winterfell? Happier than he actually realises? Let's discuss his views of women. Again, I think we can see how the culture of the Islands play a part here, as well as Theon feeling like he's weak, lacking much power or position, both as Ironborn, then as a hostage. Also, we should say the culture of Westeros in general, but even, I think, compared to a lot of other people, Theon doesn't have a very rounded, healthy view of women. He objectifies them largely to try and strengthen his own sense of masculinity. Women are less people than a means for validation. Those he sleeps with are less an intimate connection than evidence of his masculinity. And even now, I think we see all this kind of thing with a lot of young, insecure men who feel a degree of pressure to prove themselves in a culture that still carries some of these implications around sex. Both as a rite of passage for men, but also women as an object within that. And again, yes, Westeros is obviously a very different culture to our real one, but I think that's also kind of my point. It would have been even more exacerbated in the culture of Westeros than it is in ours even now. The quote before where he talks to Rob about Kyra and Bessa, I think sums a lot of this up. Theon is keen to show off what he feels is a big marker of his masculinity, especially show it off to the guy who is male heir. Let's chuck out a couple more quotes about his views on women, actually. Sage counsel. Perhaps you'd help me choose them. Let her believe I want her wisdom. Women fancy that. She looked rather stupid when she smiled, if truth be told. But he had never required a woman to be clever. Once, I might have carried you home as a prize, and kept you to wife, whether you willed it or no. The Iron Men did such things. A man had his rock wife, his true bride Ironborn like himself, but he had salt wives too. Women captured on raids. Those last two quotes there are him speaking to the captain's daughter on the ship, the Miraham, that sails Theon back to his home. She is young and naively falls for him, thinking it will lead somewhere greater, and Theon immediately discards her the second he arrives. My lord. Her eyes were red when she took off the pack. She made as if to embrace him. There, in front of her own father and his priestly uncle and half the island. Theon turned deftly aside. You have my thanks. Please, she said. I do love you well, my lord. I must go. I would imagine, again we can only speculate, but that how lacking Theon's life has been for a father figure adds to this internal pressure, this need to prove his masculinity. He's always felt like he's had to be a man on his own. I mean, okay, he did have Balon Greyjoy as a father figure until he was 10 years old, but I don't think there is any evidence that they were close. He had 2 older brothers beating him, which would have made him feel weaker about his masculinity. And then we can say Theon's father was kind of socially disgraced, and also kind of abandoned Theon, which may put him off seeing Balon like a father figure, and so if there's not a sufficient enough paternal presence to help you better understand being a man, help you feel more secure in your own identity, but also take off some of the pressure from needing to feel like a man too early on, at too early an age to even understand what being a man means, then there can be the impulse to somewhat performatively prove it to others, but also to yourself, to always be seeking more validation. And if this sounds a bit tenuous so far, then let's consider how men factor into Theon's experiences around sex. The captain's daughter, I don't believe we are ever given her name. I'm not sure Theon knows it. The important trait as far as he's concerned is that she is the captain's daughter. Having sex with her can assert a level of dominance and control over the captain, can be felt to shore up his own masculinity by doing something he imagines will belittle a different man. He put an arm around the captain's daughter. "Summon me when we make Lord Sport," he told her father. "We'll be below, in my cabin." He led the girl aft, while her father watched them go in sullen silence. The cabin was the captain's, in truth, but it had been turned over to Theon's use when they sailed from Seaguard. The captain's daughter had not been turned over for his use, but she had come to his bed willingly enough, all the same. He did not think the captain approved, and that was amusing as well, watching the man struggle to swallow his outrage while performing his courtesies to the High Lord, the rich purse of gold he had been promised, never far from his thoughts. You know, this isn't really about her, it's about the captain. Similarly, we have lots of descriptions of a woman known simply as the miller's wife. That's the important bit to him, the idea of cuckolding the miller. Not to say that the sex itself isn't important at all, I mean obviously it is, and we hear of Kyra and Bessa when there's no indication they have any relationships to other men, but this is also especially exciting to Theon. When he meets his sister Asha for the first time in years, he doesn't at first recognise her, and he flirts with her. She kind of oddly leans into that in order to later mock him down the line, but she pretends she's a shipwright's wife named Esgred who is currently pregnant, and this excites Theon all the more. His present companion was more to his taste. That she was wed to his father's shipwright, and pregnant to boot, only made her more intriguing. When Theon later takes over Winterfell, he makes a big thing of having sex with Kyra in what he repeatedly refers to as Ned Stark's bed. There had been a certain undeniable spice to fucking a common tavern wench in Lord Eddard Stark's own bed. Which is fitting for 2 reasons. One, it's an idea of imagined power over Ned, a half revenge for the lack of warmth that Theon always craved from him, or for the approval he craved. But secondly, that he still refers to this as Ned Stark's bed, not his own bed after taking Winterfell, and not even, like, Robb Stark's bed, Robb who became Lord of Winterfell. Ned's been dead quite a while at this point. The fact this is still Ned's room, that Theon is kind of defiling it, exerting his rebellion over it, rather than having a right to this chamber, suggests he feels undeserving deep down, and the fact it's still Ned's suggests the man holds a stronger part in Theon's heart and mind than he currently cares to realise. Does he feel confident and assured in the reality of capturing Winterfell for himself, or is this more like playing out a fantasy he doesn't truly believe in? In fact, there are many moments, long after Ned is dead and, well, not exactly buried, but where Theon shudders to think what Ned Stark would say if he could see him now. Theon thought of seeking out the bodies of the 2 men he'd slain himself, to see if they had any jewellery worth taking. But the notion left a bitter taste in his mouth. He could imagine what Eddard Stark would have said. Yet that thought made him angry too. Stark is dead and rotten, and naught to me, he reminded himself. Or, more interestingly, how often he compares his own behaviours and abilities to Ned Stark. He only wished he had killed him cleaner. Ned Stark had never needed more than a single blow to take a man's head. How much of this sexual game Theon is playing is about wanting to belittle other men, But then, how much of that desire is because of a deeper drive to want to live up to them, to want to be as good and worthy as the great Eddard Stark, set against the anger that comes from never quite feeling able to live up to them, and how women just become a tool drawn into this hurricane of his own internal struggle. The fact he is so excited to have sex with someone else in Ned Stark's bed, rather than seeing that as his own bed, I think is great for that kind of conflict. And also we should add, this isn't all just sex. A lot of this general mockery feeds the same impulse too. The fact, as Robb's companion, he is consistently mocking Roose Bolton, for example, is an interesting one. Once, a boy called Theon Greyjoy had enjoyed tweaking Bolton as they sat at council with Robb Stark, mocking his soft voice and making japes about leeches. He must have been mad. This is no man to jape with. Let's also mention Catelyn. We don't know much about Theon's mum, as we've said, or even his relationship to his sister. He doesn't remember much about her, and when they do meet, Theon is more interested in flirting and seeing her as a woman for his own means of sex. But Catelyn he describes, as the quote we read out earlier highlighted, as someone cold towards him. His lady wife was, if anything, even more distant and suspicious. And Catelyn never likes him, Catelyn never trusts him, and I think this is mainly overprotectiveness for her son. She sees Theon not just as a pompous arse who is always smiling in a way she doesn't like, but he is a Greyjoy who, for all Ned's kindness, might still harbour some resentment against the Starks. And she is afraid this may lead to him one day betraying Robb. I think that's her loose position. But how does Theon feel about Catelyn? This cold woman who sees him as someone potentially treacherous, who denies him warmth and care. Well, in general, there's not a huge amount to suggest Theon ever had much care from women. All his closeness is sexuality based, and very little, if any, intimacy within that. I suppose I'm going on a tangent now, but the quite horrible quote I think we should definitely mention somewhere in this video, because it's worth emphasising just how awful this can be, is a moment Theon has with Kyra. He has been described having sex with her many times at Winterfell, seemingly consensual, but things are going badly with his rule there. He is struggling to sleep, he is terrified, he is stressed, he is haunted by thoughts of Bran and Rickon and how this is all going to end. Kyra is someone he could be a little vulnerable with, could open up a bit to, seek comfort within the intimacy there. Instead, he does this. He sent for Kyra, kicked the door shut, climbed on top of her, and fucked the wench with a fury he'd never known was in him. By the time he finished, she was sobbing, her neck and breasts were covered with bruises and bite marks. Theon shoved her from the bed and threw her a blanket. Get out! Yet even then, he could not sleep. It's horrible. Overall, Theon is not a man without compassion and care. We do see compassion from him at many times in these books. However, that's also what's so haunting about the reality here. Sometimes abuse like this doesn't just come from totally immoral, totally uncompassionate people. Sometimes it has more to do with a lack of space to healthily express difficult feelings and a very warped, dehumanizing worldview towards women. His compassion is absent here because he's thinking of Kyra as an object to ease his rage, not as a person. And I'm not saying that to excuse his actions at all, by the way. I'm pointing it out to highlight that the problem of SA runs deeper and can be more difficult to resolve than we as a society often care to try and address. You know, often people have the attitude that there are just some naturally awful people out there who commit SA, that they are just bad apples that the police deal with. They get rid of them, job done. We don't have to think any further about issues involving, you know, education, cultural attitudes, prevention, all sorts of things I wished we addressed better as a world than just projecting the problem outwards onto villains and leaving it at that. Anyway, that's all a tangent. I just thought it was worth mentioning somewhere. But the point was, Theon, you might imagine, could be quite resentful towards Catelyn, talk derogatively of her, with that kind of, a woman is either lesser if she lets you have sex with her, or a bitch if she denies you type mentality. We see this crop up in moments a little towards other women from Theon, but as far as I'm aware, Theon has never expressed expressed anything negative towards Catelyn, beyond the mention that she is distant and suspicious towards him. Which is interesting. When the idea of having sex in Ned Stark's bed excites him so much, it's potential for the same reasons he would have fantasies about having sex with Catelyn. We don't see any of that. I'm not entirely sure what this means, but I do think it's interesting. Something we do have evidence for in relation to Catelyn is from Catelyn's own chapters and the dialogue Theon has towards her in those chapters. Theon Greyjoy put a hand on the hilt of his blade and said, "My lady, if it comes to that, my house owes yours a great debt." This is the scene where Catelyn is discussing her theory about the attempted murder of Bran. Earlier in that scene we also get, "Lord Eddard is a second father to me," said Theon Greyjoy. "I do so swear." This strikes me as someone very keen to win her approval, and not in a way at all related to sex here. I mean, do you normally hear Theon talking like this, sounding so earnest and solemn? Not that he isn't without his humour in relation to Catelyn, but certainly very keen to impress her. "Sir Brynden has seen to it already, my lady," Theon replied with a cocky smile. "A few more blackbirds and we should have enough to bake a pie. I'll save you their feathers for a hat." "But such a battle," said Theon Greyjoy eagerly. "My lady, the realm has not seen such a victory since the Field of Fire. I vow, Lannisters lost 10 men for every one of ours that fell. We've taken close to 100 knights captive and a dozen lords bannermen. Lord Westerlin, Lord Banefort, Sir Garth Greenfield, Lord Estron, Sir Titus Brax, my Lord Adornishman, and 3 Lannisters besides Jaime, Lord Tywin's own nephews, 2 of his sister's sons and 1 of his dead brothers. And Lord Tywin?" Catelyn interrupted. There's actually quite a few moments like this one, where Theon is talking to her enthusiastically, almost like a child babbling onto their mum about some latest triumph of theirs, wanting to hear a "well done, Theon, you were part of something great," and Theon never getting that from her. Not necessarily because Catelyn is trying to put him down in these situations. She does misunderstand his insecurity as genuine cockiness, but she is also very anxious in these moments, anxious about the war, generally reticent to talk up any of the successes in case it kind of jinxes things. But I think we can imagine from Theon's perspective how moments like this might sting. And I will also point out, in all his interactions with Catelyn, Theon consistently is addressing her "my lady." He's not doing anything to kind of undermine her authority in that kind of way. For all his treatment of women, I think from this we could perhaps speculate that what he really wants deep down, if he were just able to put aside his defences for one moment, he'd realise is approval and affection from women. Something perhaps maternal that can ease his insecurities rather than mask them. Something intimate, something accepting. Which is the thing about using women as a tool for sex. As much as that might feel like a great conquest, you've been allowed to have sex with this woman, you've attracted her in some kind of way. Does that feel like deep acceptance, like she understands you as a whole person and accepts you for that and lets you in on a more emotional level? No. If we really wanted to stretch this speculation, we could wonder if this is part of what excites Theon about pregnant women, but that is quite a bit of conjecture. I'm going to leave that thought with you. And also there's obviously Theon seeking something paternal, that he doesn't have to feel like a lesser rival to, that he doesn't have to feel beneath, where he doesn't have to belittle and undermine them in order to reinforce himself. If you think there sounds something faintly Oedipal about this, then you wouldn't be wrong. Anyway, another point that's slightly less conjecture is that I think Theon, with time, starts to realise he cares for the miller's wife. This woman who was at first just the miller's wife, just someone to have a bit of fun with. She is later killed and both her sons burned so they can pose as the corpses of Bran and Rickon. Now, partly he may think of her so much because of his feelings about Bran and Rickon, partly it may be the deep, so awful thought he can only allude to it subconsciously that those sons of hers she had could have technically been his own sons, although that suggests Theon had sex with her from a worryingly young age, but this is a theory people often discuss. Or maybe he thinks of her so much because she means more to him than he previously recognised. Because we go from this quote, Theon knew the mill. He'd even tumbled the miller's wife a time or two. There was nothing special about it, or her. To this, which is a quote about nightmares he's been having. The night before, it had been the miller's wife. Theon had forgotten her name, but he remembered her body. Soft, pillowy breasts and stretch marks on her belly. The way she had clawed his back when he fucked her. Last night in his dream, he had been in bed with her once again. but this time she had teeth above and below, and tore out his throat even as she was gnawing off his manhood. It was madness. I think this dream hints feelings of emasculation, we should mention, both in the light of his guilt about capturing Winterfell, the imagined Starks to rise up and quash his rebellion the way they did to Balon Greyjoys, but also hinting that he may have felt some of this in childhood, even at the time of the Greyjoy rebellion too. How emasculating it may have made his father seem in his eyes, or even Theon himself with the logic of, damn, if my father, who always seemed so strong and fierce, this guy I've aspired to be, if even he can be emasculated like this, then what am I? Which again is an issue with a culture so zealous about seeming strong, because when something inevitably happens that reveals some vulnerability, do they know how to handle that without feeling completely emasculated? Anyway, we then go to this quote. The two we killed were just some miller's sons. Theon didn't want to think about their mother. He had known the miller's wife for years. He had even bedded her. Big, heavy breasts with wide dark nipples, a sweet mouth, a merry laugh. Joys that I will never taste again. You know, I'm hardly going to pretend that quote shows affection. He is describing her in relation to her breasts. But there is also now an awareness she matters, an awareness he's been trying to resist, I think, which perhaps is also partly why he is still only talking about her in terms of sex and the joys she might give to him. I think there is some resistance still even now, but maybe underneath that could be an awareness she matters much more than he's willing to let on, willing to admit here. I mean, maybe not, it's just a theory. I just think it's interesting how often she comes up in his thoughts. Not even the miller's sons, but her especially. Anyway, enough of this speculation. Let's talk a little more concretely about approval. So in the second book, Theon sails home to Pike with a letter from Robb. He is charged with trying to convince Lord Balon to lend Robb Stark, King in the North, his longship so they might fight and defeat the Lannisters in battle. In return for his help, Robb will support Balon as becoming a king in his own right, independent from the rest of Westeros, the way Robb has declared the North independent. Theon heads there very eager to agree this deal, and what happens is a capitulation. Very quickly, Balon tears up the letter without even reading it, sets out his own plan of basically attacking and capturing the Northern Territory, whilst so many of Robb's forces are down south. And Theon then very quickly joins in with this plan, betrays Robb, and even ends up capturing Winterfell as a whole. It's a pretty big betrayal from Theon as far as Westerosi betrayals go, and this section is loosely about approval, but really I want to set out three things, because people often misunderstand Theon here. They think he never cared for the Starks, think he is cold and cruel and an awful person. I want to set out firstly just how much, even in these chapters, Theon cares for Robb especially. Secondly, how doomed Theon was from the start. And thirdly, just how much his desperation for approval shapes his actions. So to tackle Robb, really quickly, I'm going to chuck out a load of quotes as he and his uncles meet Aeron Greyjoy. Remember, we've already seen his passionate loyalty towards Robb in front of other Northerners, but how is he when surrounded with people who hate the Starks? People where it's best to keep his passion secret, to deny it completely. Will I find my sister and Lady Mother at Pike? You will not. Your mother dwells on Harlow with her own sister. It is less raw there, and her cough troubles her. Your sister has taken Black Winds to Great Wick, with messages from your Lord Father. She will return ere long, you may be sure. Theon did not need to be told that Black Winds was Asher's longship. He had not seen his sister in 10 years, but that much he knew of her. Odd that she would call it that, when Robb Stark had a wolf named Grey Wind. Stark is grey, and Greyjoy's black, he murmured, smiling. But it seems we're both windy. You know, we pointed out earlier that he doesn't stop to ask if his mum is well. Instead, he stops to try and draw a parallel between his best mate Robb Stark and his Greyjoy family. Oh, her ship is Black Wind? Robb has a wolf named Grey Wind. You know, it's kind of sweet. I think also maybe suggests he's hoping he can have a friendship with Usher the way he has with Robb. There's then this quote. For Robb himself, Theon did have a certain affection, as for a younger brother, but it would be best not to mention that. In Pike, it would seem the old wars were still being fought. That ought not surprise him. The islands lived in the past. The present was too hard and bitter to be borne. This comes after a moment where his uncle has suggested Theon is too Stark-like, and we got a long description of Theon's internal thoughts, setting out all the ways he is unlike the Starks, all the ways he has no care for them. And even in this long essay of convincing himself how un-Stark-like he is, he still can't help bigging up Robb at least a little bit, and also some of the worldview he would have learned in the North to have about the Ironborn, that they're living in the past. They rode in the gloom of silence. Finally, Theon could suffer it no longer. "Robb Stark is Lord of Winterfell now," he said. I love this one, like he's just been bursting to talk about his best mate Robb. "He heeds me, yes. I've hunted with him, trained with him, shared meat and mead with him, warred at his side. I have earned his trust. He looks on me as an older brother." He says even to Balon, you know, Theon is very, very close with Robb. Even as Reek, he thinks of him constantly. And whilst he's again denied a lot of space to grieve, he is still deeply, deeply hurt by Robb's death. That was long ago though. They were all dead now. Jory, old Sir Roderick, Lord Eddard, Harwin and Hullen, Cain and Desmond and Fat Tom, Alan with his dreams of knighthood, Micken who had given him his first real sword, even old Nan, like as not, and Robb. Robb, who had been more a brother to Theon than any son born of Balon Greyjoy's loins. Murdered at the Red Wedding. Butchered by the phrase, "I should have been with him. Where was I? I should have died with him." I love that quote. It moves me, and it goes to show underneath all of this insecurity and masking of feelings is a real deep bond between them. Theon never ever wanted to betray Robb, I don't think, and you know that especially because of how little he ever mentions Robb during his time capturing Winterfell. That's the time you don't want Robb cropping up into your mind, you know? It's Ned Stark he talks about there, that's who his rivalry is with. Never Robb. He doesn't want to think about taking Winterfell away from Robb, just from Ned. So, what happened? If he doesn't want to betray Robb, why did it happen? Well, as I said, he was doomed from the start. As he's sailing up to Pike, he notices all the longships have been prepared. Had Lord Balon anticipated him and called the Greyjoy banners? His hand went inside his cloak again to the oilskin pouch. No one knew of his letter but Robb Stark. They were no fools to entrust their secrets to a bird. Still, Lord Balon was no fool either. He might well have guessed why his son was coming home at long last, and acted accordingly. The thought did not please him. His father's war was long done, and lost. This was Theon's hour, his plan, his glory, and in time his crown. Yet if the longships are hosting... Without any news for the reason Theon is on his way to Pike, why would Balon call the banners and amass his forces? The two possibilities are both unpleasant ones. One being that now Theon is back, Balon is ready to rebel again. That he has got his own plan and it will likely differ from Theon's one. The alternative is Balon either didn't know Theon was coming back or didn't care, and that he was assembling his forces regardless. He was planning to attack the north regardless. And if he doesn't care whether Theon was coming home or not, that might mean he was happy to sentence Theon to death. Say Theon was still in the company of the Starks, sentence his son to be executed by the Starks as a result of him attacking the north. That is the bigger fear, one that might exacerbate all his fears around abandonment. I mean, obviously the quote did suggest Balon knew his son was coming back, even if he didn't know why, so that point may not be the case, but then again, it takes time to assemble the longships. They may have even been building some for a while. I think it will at the least be a fear of Theon's, due to the fact Theon may already partly fear his father doesn't care about him. But yeah, also generally, regardless of what Theon does or tries to do, if he arrives with the aim of convincing Balon to help the North, only the North is then suddenly attacked by Balon when he doesn't listen to Theon. It kind of doesn't matter what Theon does, he is then going to look like a turncloak either way, especially when Catelyn kept insisting he would betray them. Either he somehow succeeds in convincing Balon to work with the Starks, or he is going to be branded a turncloak, whether he takes part or not. This is also what's so very concerning about the fact Balon is refusing to let any trade ships leave the harbour. Obviously this is to prevent spreading words that he is called to the banners, but does it also mean he would prevent Theon leaving, from maybe even contacting Robb. In fact, when he finds out the plan is to attack the north, Balon would definitely prevent Theon from being able to do that, because doing so would mean Theon betraying the Greyjoys, giving the Stark the heads up on their attack. But on the other side, if Theon doesn't do that, and quite literally can't do that, is he betraying the Starks? They're not going to know this attack is happening, they're not even going to know it's against Theon's will, that he tried to put up a fight, you know? So I think he's going to, at least to some extent, look like a bit of a turncloak either way. Whether Robb would believe that, I don't know, but with Catelyn in his ear telling him Theon was always going to betray him, he might do. And even then, how much should he risk arguing against Balon? Theon sees no honour guard waiting for him at the harbour, no great care for him. Even when he gets to Pike, he is given the very chambers that gave the bloody keep its name, the story being this. 1,000 years before, the sons of the River King had been slaughtered here, hacked to bits in their beds so that the pieces of their bodies may be sent back to their father on the mainland. Being given this specific chamber feels like a hint to Theon. Adds in the fact Theon arrived with no guard of his own. He was expecting to be welcomed and cherished like family, but a cold reception where they may not even care for him at all. We get a quote where Theon is terrified crossing the bridge on the way to meet Balon. I think this is partly set up for the fact Balon will later be killed here, and to emphasise how un-Greyjoy Theon is feeling. But also I think there's a metaphor here about danger. Theon's heart was in his mouth by the time he was halfway across. A long way below, the waves threw up plumes of spray as they crashed against the rock. As a boy, he used to run across this bridge, even in the black of night. Boys believe nothing can hurt them, his doubt whispered. Grown men know better. Theon is generally in danger here. If I have no defences, no allies with me, no escape, and if my father doesn't care whether I live or die, if he's already decided Usher is his heir, I might be dispensed with should I oppose him. I think he feels there's only so far he can push his arguments against Balon before it puts his life at risk. If he's seen too much as a Stark, he might be deemed an enemy. And in that context, I think a lot of people also misunderstand Theon's entitlement in this section of the book. I mean, he is entitled. There is a level of arrogance, or at least insecurity masking as arrogance. There is an eagerness to just adopt this birthright that he's been stewing on for the last 9 years. But really, how much of this entitlement is the desire for proof that his father loves him? That's why he doesn't want to have to work and to earn the approval, to just begin with like the small amount of longships, gradually earn trust and favour and prove himself a devoted son. He's had a whole life of conditional love from Eddard, but this is his real father, the one he might have always partly feared abandoned him. Now Theon wants evidence that wasn't the case, wants to be seen as a son, wants to know he has been loved all this time. No wonder he arrives on Pike immediately talking about his birthright, you know? However, to Ironborn culture, this desire to be loved and approved of comes across as too entitled and too green. Which is also, I think, apart from Balon just having already made up his mind, is why Theon fails in his attempts to convince him of the new plan. He's too desperate for Balon's approval. And I could be incredibly wrong here. This is just like one thought to throw out because I'm interested what people might think of it. I mean, as I say, Theon could be under some very real danger here and might be reluctant to argue too much as a result. That might be very sensible. However, knowing the Ironborn customs of the Kingsmoot, even if it's a kind of historical one at this point, and their custom of showing strength, proving their merit, taking what they deserve, and the fact Balon was already disgraced once, I do wonder what would have happened if Theon did just turn up here and oppose him, came in chucking his weight around, going, my father is old and weak and his plan is bad, I have a better plan, a more ambitious plan. Why feed off the scraps of Moat Cailin when we can storm Casterly Rock for all its riches? The rational reason Balon gives against this plan of Theon's is basically he's afraid to take on Casterly Rock. Casterly Rock is too strong, and Lord Tywin too cunning by half. Aye, we might take Lannisport, but we should never keep it. No, I hunger for a different plum. Not so juicy sweet, to be sure, yet it hangs there ripe and undefended. What would have happened if Theon responded by calling him a coward? If Theon had appealed to his sister and Victarion and told them the same thing, would they be more swayed by talk of Casterly Rock riches? By talk of Balon being a coward who has already failed and been disgraced once? Could Theon frame himself less as defending the Starks than just that they're too unambitious a target, that we can use them as a political pawn to help us, rather than one we have to attack? I don't know, this could be a terrible take. The fact he doesn't do this partly is because it would be dangerous, not to mention it's a hell of a political move to expect a 19-year-old to play, especially when he hasn't even been home since he was 10. So I can say all that, but I also want to add the other motivation that I think he doesn't want to oppose his father. He wants his love and approval much more than he wants to be a rival. For all his talk about his father's day being done, Balon being weak and foolish, this being Theon's hour, it's not really technically glory and triumph and power Theon is after. I mean, he is, but I think deeper down, it's still approval, acceptance, validation from people, be it Stark or Greyjoy. Just somebody to tell him, wow, Theon, that was brilliant, you know? Why would you charge in here wanting to rival your dad if what you always wanted was his affection? I mean, he tried that at first to win Eddard Stark's approval and affection, let's remember. He tried so very hard for 9 years to be a Stark, and it never quite works the way he wanted, because Theon probably already felt a level of absent parental love and support during his development, which I think in general we can factor into why he does so eagerly want validation from everyone. I mean, how much is validation papering over the cracks of the absence there, and how much is it a genuine fulfillment? I think it's kind of both to an extent in these examples, but it's only after he couldn't win Eddard's support that he ever talked about rivaling him and finding excitement in, you know, having sex with Kyra in Ned Stark's bed, being the Prince of Winterfell. And so seeing Balon, his first instinct again is to win Balon's approval. I could never sufficiently be a Stark, but maybe I can sufficiently be a Greyjoy. Maybe they just need to see it. You know, it hurts he should have to prove himself to them, but there is also hope that it is possible to do so. Add to that, his sister is currently favoured over him, which, knowing Theon's views on women, likely makes him feel emasculated and weak rather than just less favoured, and he will want to combat that feeling. So having already failed to chuck his weight around and play that very big, very risky gamble that it would be a lot to expect him to play, Theon can now either sullenly be reluctant and hesitant to oppose the Starks, hesitant to join in with this plan, and look, in their eyes, even weaker and more green as a result, at a time he's already feeling humiliated here. He can either choose to do that and achieve very little in the process, or he can join in, and if he is going to be a turncloak, he can at least be a competent one who can win glory and approval here, even if it's at the cost of his Starkness. I think it's too simple to just call Theon horrible for this decision. I think when you look at it, you can understand a lot of sense behind it. And I do think the desire and hope for approval does dictate a lot of his behaviour in general, both Stark and Greyjoy. Either he is given it, and he is happy to then identify there, yes, I am a Stark, they are family. Or he is a Greyjoy through and through. Or in the moments he isn't given approval, he kind of does the opposite. I was never a Stark, I was a hostage, they were terrible to me. Or, whilst I am a Greyjoy and I want my birthright and I can prove myself worthy, yes, also my father is a fool, all these Iron Islanders are fools living in the past, I will change everything when I'm in charge, they will see, they will learn how much better a ruler I am. I like this quote about even Robb for that kind of reason. Theon is comparing him to Dagmar Cleftjaw. He gave me more smiles than my father and Eddard together. Even Robb. He ought to have won a smile the day he'd saved Bran from that wildling. But instead he'd gotten a scolding, as if he were some cook who burned a stew. Here is a man just so desperate for approval, and so hurt when he isn't given it. And yeah, I do think so much of his identity pings back and forth between Stark and Greyjoy as a result of how he feels in relation to approval and acceptance from them. Let's move on. Theon decides, rather than to content himself with raiding fishing villages as Balon instructs him to do, to instead capture Winterfell. And again, we're seeing a desire to prove himself, to win approval, but also if he has to defy Robb regardless, or is at least already going to be seen as a turncloak, he might as well commit. He might as well actually gain some respect from one side of these two opposed families. Which I should add is the important context behind that previous quote I showed of Robb looking at him like the cook who burned the stew. We probably shouldn't read too much into that quote, because he says it at a point where he is already pretty much forced to betray Robb, to go against his own morals there, and so he is trying his best to criticise Robb as a way to ease his moral concerns, to convince himself they're not as close as they actually are. And this is like the best criticism he can find to make of Robb. I mean, I think there's a lot of other factors in general why Theon does turn on the Starks. It's not just that. There's also, you know, the culture of the Ironborn, the fact a part of him probably does feel hurt that the Starks attacked Pike before, the fact he's feeling outmatched by Usher, I think is a massive one, and how emasculating that feels and how driven he is to try and prove himself against that. Whatever else I'm forgetting. A lot of kind of obvious factors, I think, are also present. I don't want to make it sound like they're not here just because they're not the ones I'm focusing on. I just don't think they need much expressing. But in many ways, what Theon does with his plan to capture Winterfell is genuinely brilliant. With so few people, he pulls off something really, really impressive for a 19-year-old, maybe 20-year-old at this point. When you have an idea that is that good, that's tactically cunning, it's easy to understand why he'd be suckered in by his own genius, I think. Easy to see why he'd be lulled by the excitement and the possibility, excited by the fact that this plan could work rather than should he go with it, you know? For all Theon's tactical ingenuity, he has no greater foresight here to consider what will happen once he captures it. And I think the deeper reason for this is because Theon is getting to carry out a fantasy of his, getting to be Lord of Winterfell, or Prince, he calls himself, so as not to feel a direct rival to beloved Robb here. Which is funny when you think about it. Robb is Lord of Winterfell, so I'll be Prince. Or even, Robb is King in the North, so I'll be Prince of Winterfell. I suspect the title of Prince probably has more to do with the fact he's not from the North, but even so, he always wanted to be a Stark, always wanted Winterfell to be his home, and even more so, he always wanted to marry his two conflicting identities together, Greyjoy and Stark, to make them one. And he couldn't do this with Robb's initial letter to Balon Greyjoy that they should join their forces, but he can kind of do it this way. He can be a proud Greyjoy, accepted by his father, outshining his sister, winning all sorts of glory there, and also be at Winterfell with Bran and Rickon and all these other people that he can now also flaunt his authority over. Without any foresight, you can see the massive appeal, and so much of his rule at Winterfell feels like Theon is playing. When he first speaks to Bran, it is almost child's play. I'm Prince Theon now. We're both princes now, Bran. Who would have dreamed it? But I've taken your castle, my prince. I sent 4 men over the walls with grappling claws and ropes, and they opened a postern gate for the rest of us. My men are dealing with yours even now. I promise you, Winterfell is mine. He just wants to play out this fantasy as though it's totally removed from all morality and political troubles. In fact, I think because this fantasy is so appealing, so much what his internal world is after, that is kind of why he thinks about it so removed from morality and political troubles and the reality of it, you know? The fantasy is so enticing, he forgets the reality. And the tragedy then is all of the actual reality slowly seeping in and Theon slowly beginning to recognise how stupid this whole thing always was. This is perhaps my favourite tragedy arc from the books, watching all of Theon's hopes slowly crumble away and then ends the way it does. It's both a brilliant read and one I really, really struggle to manage. It hurts on so many levels. I mean, Theon literally got a crown made for himself to try and play this out. This guy who still calls the bed Ned Stark's bed. Last of all, he donned his crown. A band of cold iron, slim as a finger, set with heavy chunks of black diamond and nuggets of gold. It was misshapen and ugly, but there was no help for that. Mikken lay buried in the lickyard, and the new smith was capable of little more than nails and horseshoes. Theon consoled himself with the reminder that it was only a prince's crown. He would have something much finer when he was crowned king. It's so painfully wishful, and he makes all these big claims that no one is going to be hurt, I'm going to be an honourable ruler like Ned Stark, and he seems to then expect the people here will just accept him. They'll just happily serve and proclaim him a good ruler, no one will be hurt, and Bran and Rickon will just be kept comfortably in the castle. Like,
This is literally just a game where someone else gets a turn to play out being king and bossing the others around, rather than thinking of the actual real-world consequences of this. Because the reality is, it isn't child's play. He is messing with people's entire lives here. Not only at Winterfell, but the entire politics of everything going on down for Robb. And he has brought a band of Ironborn who hate the Starks and believe in pillaging. You can't just wear a misshapen crown and hope to resolve all of these conflicts with a wave of your hand. I might have killed every man of you and given your women to my soldiers for their pleasure, but instead I protected you. Is this the thanks you offer? He tells people like they should be grateful he stormed their home just because he didn't kill them. This is, again, desire for approval, I think, for the people to praise him a good leader. He spends so much of these chapters ruminating on what other people think of his rule, desperate for acceptance, half desperate for the Ironborn to respect him through his firmness and cruelty, half desperate for the Winterfell people to respect him for his kindness, and he's just getting nowhere with this. Which is also then what makes him so susceptible to other people's suggestions. I would say about 80% of the time, when anyone makes a suggestion to him while he's Prince of Winterfell, Theon agrees with it or concedes. At best, he has this habit of agreeing to what other people say, but then trying to assert his authority again by adding some, like, cheap demands to the end of it, some cheap little clause. Like, here's an example. Maester Lewin asks Hodor to be released. Hodor was nothing to him. If he does not fight us, we will let him live. Theon pointed a finger. But say one word about sparing a wildling, and you can die with her. She swore me an oath, and pissed on it. Or this, Reek claims he can win Theon some troops in exchange that he be allowed to have sex with Kyra. He had gone too far with Reek to turn back now. 200 men and she's yours. But a man less, and you can go back to fucking pigs. Many of his actions are swayed by Reek in particular, or this is Ramsay Bolton disguised as Reek, the original Reek. Okay, in the books, Ramsay had a servant called Reek from when he was young, before Theon. But then Ramsay does some stuff in the first books, and he is going to be captured and executed by the Starks. And so when he's being hunted down, Ramsay switches costumes with his servant Reek, and pretends to be Reek, so that Reek gets thrown in a cell where they're later deciding what to do with him, and the Reek disguised as Ramsay is executed. When Theon captures Winterfell, Reek is in the prisons there, Theon releases him. Yeah, Theon releases Reek and then listens to him here much more than anyone else, much more than Lewin, I think, mainly because Reek isn't forcing him to consider his morality, which is now already burdened with so much guilt and horror at what he's already done. Probably anger at his own stupidity to think this could all just be a child's dream. Reek to Theon feels like a desperate hope to dig his way out of all of this horror without having to kind of go back on it and face the consequences. And also, generally, Theon is desperate for someone to be on his side, to agree with him, to tell him he's not being an awful leader, a person to help him, to encourage, to be his hype man the way he once was for Robb. So Reek, or I mean Ramsay, I should be saying Ramsay, shouldn't I? I think he easily senses how helpless Theon feels right now, and that makes it very easy to keep pushing him further and further and manipulating him more and more. It is Reek's suggestions to burn the Miller's sons, for example. And by the way, I'm not saying any of this like we should, like it's not Theon's fault as well. He does agree to all of this. It is also Reek's suggestion to secretly murder some of the Ironborn. Yeah, this happens. Many of the Ironborn, of course, witness the Miller's boys being killed and burned and staged to look like Bran and Rickon. The Miller's wife is also killed in this scene. But these Ironborn could let the word slip that these children aren't actually Bran and Rickon. The real Bran and Rickon escaped. How humiliating that would make Theon look, how politically weak. So Reek suggests to Theon killing those Ironborn who know. Obviously he can't outright execute them, so they basically secretly murder them one by one to make it look like someone in the castle has been doing it. We don't see this plan, we don't see the exchange of suggesting it, we only learn it from a few elusive hints we get of Theon's thoughts where he is clearly trying not to think about this too much. He could not let the killings go unpunished. Farland was as likely a suspect as any, so Theon sat in judgment, called him guilty, and condemned him to death. I had no choice, he wanted to scream at the corpse. The Ironborn can't keep secrets, they had to die. Someone had to take the blame for it. He only wished he had killed him cleaner.
Which is interesting, by the way, because he's obviously expressing guilt here about Farlan, and as quoted previously, we see guilt and grief about the miller's wife and sons, which, as much as I do suggest could hint he feels more towards her than he realises, it could also just be basic empathy and compassion for someone innocent. But there's not much guilt or compassion for the Ironborn men killed here, is there? Men who just followed Theon's own orders. He's not hugely sorry they had to die, only that Farlan had to take the blame for it. That's interesting, isn't it? I mean, either we could see that as projecting onto the other Ironborn, pouring all his own self-hatred at the immorality of his actions onto them here, or we can just say it hints he maybe feels far less for the Ironborn than he even realises. There's this later quote anyway, Theon thinking of Reek.
It made him uneasy to see the man walking around, breathing, with what he knew. I should have killed him after he did the others, he reflected, but the notion made him nervous. Unlikely as it seemed, Reek could read and write, and he was possessed of enough base cunning to have hidden an account of what they'd done. We'll get to why that is important much later on. Right now, that's most of what I have to say about this section of the story. Usher comes and tries to convince him to leave, to abandon the castle. There is no need to stay, and she is absolutely correct, I think, in this comment. Oh, it was cleverly done, I'll grant you. If you only had the good sense to raise the castle and carry the two little princelings back to Pike as hostages, you might have won the war in a stroke. You'd like that, wouldn't you? See my prize reduced to ruins and ashes. If Theon was really, truly committed to fighting the Starks, he could come away as a hero amongst the Ironborn. But he didn't want to do that. He wasn't committed to fighting the Starks at all, which is crazy to say when you look at everything he ended up doing. Theon wanted to merge the two houses in this foolish, wishful, tragic way and only tumbled down this dark, awful, desperate slope of worse and worse crimes, the more he felt that dream fading. He sends Reek out to gather more troops, who returns as Ramsay Bolton with a lot of Bolton men, and they then raise the castle the second Theon opens the gates. Publicly he blames this all on Theon, and pretends Theon was killed, and takes him as a captive. The two saddest thoughts for me in all of this is that Theon keeps Bran's old brooch close in his possessions all the time after he burns the Miller's boys, which kind of shows he feels more than he lets on, and also that the last thing he sees before passing out when Ramsay attacks is his horse Smiler, screaming as Ramsay sets its mane on fire. Something about that image really stings me. It's also obviously metaphorically fitting that his horse is named Smiler. It's time we discussed the least pleasant aspects of this story. So, Theon is taken prisoner by Ramsay. He is tortured. He is flayed and left in so much unbearable pain until he begs Ramsay to cut off the flayed finger or the flayed toe or whatever it might be. He has his teeth broken. He is starved. He is left in the dark of a cell alone for God knows how long. He is weak. His hair has turned grey. His skin sickly. He struggles to walk, to eat. It is awful, in short. A lot worse than you see in the show, although thankfully you don't actually see this in the books. When we meet Reek, all of this has already happened. He has been left in the dark of a cell for longer than he can tell. Part of him is terrified 10 years might have passed. He has spent days trying to catch a rat to eat in the dark of his cell. The meat was stringy, but so rich he thought he might be sick. He chewed and swallowed, picking small bones from the holes in his gums where the teeth had been yanked out. It hurt to chew, but he was so hungry he could not stop. I had to. The rats bit him when he slept, gnawing at his fingers and his toes, even at his face. When he got his hands on one, he did not hesitate. Eat or be eaten, those were the only choices. I did it, he mumbled. I did, I ate him. They do the same to me, please. Perhaps because this is uncomfortable territory, I don't have too much to say about this section. I think there's a lot more to say when he returns to Winterfell and we start to see some of Theon begin to creep in again, but this section is mostly just trauma response. Theon is under the terrible threat of both psychic and literal survival. There is not much personality or character exploration to dig into when almost everything is drawn back into survival, into trauma response. The two main ones we see being
being freeze and friend. Now, if you watched my Sansa character analysis, you'll know we touched on similar points here. Friend is a trauma response they both fall upon as a very sensible way to try and stay alive, appease your captor, speak the way he wants you to speak, think the way he wants you to think, put him more at ease by showing submission and servitude. The nature of these examples between Sansa and Joffrey, and here between Reek and Ramsay, are very different, but it is largely the same idea, and it is, yeah, very sensible. Defy Ramsay, and you'll be flayed even more. My lord was only japing, he tried to tell himself. He does not want to hurt me. He told me so. He only does it when I give him cause. His lord was merciful and kind. He might have flayed his face off for some of the things Reek had said, before he'd learned his true name and proper place. It's not that Theon genuinely believes Ramsay is merciful and kind, it's that it's currently safer to believe that, and to think that way, and to shut down the kind of feelings that contradict it. He can't risk feeling hatred towards Ramsay, for example. He can't risk appearing disobedient. You do want to serve me, I know. Yes, my lord. More than anything. A shiver went through him. I'm your Reek. Please let me serve you. Please. Since you ask so nicely, how can I deny you? Theon did defy at first, and did even attempt an escape when Kyra got hold of the keys. He thinks about this a lot, Kyra and her keys. Kyra found some keys, managed to let them out to try and escape, only they were then caught. Hunted through the woods like prey, essentially. Kyra was killed by Ramsay's dogs, and Theon terribly punished, and true or not, Theon largely believes Ramsay allowed Kyra to get the keys so he could make a sport of hunting down their escape, could test them. Theon often fears any slight chance of freedom is a test from Ramsay that he would be punished for trying to take. This is a very horrible experience to understandably break Theon's belief in escape. Not to mention, Kyra dying here means Theon is now entirely alone. It's much, much harder to muster the courage to risk trying to save yourself if it's just you're doing it for. Theon, let us not forget, is also haunted by his actions at Winterfell. The more the reality of what he did there seeps in, the more horrific it feels for him. Killing the miller's wife and sons, killing Mikken and Farlan, and potentially Bran and Rickon died out in the wilderness for all he knows. He betrayed the Starks, he betrayed his home. This is perhaps what's most interesting about Theon's time as Reek. It's not just he's forced to be Reek instead of Theon, it's that I don't think he even wants to be Theon, because that is a person wrapped with so much guilt at his own cruelty, that to be Reek is almost a relief. I've come this way before. It was a dangerous thought, and he regretted it at once. No, he said. No, that was some other man. That was before you knew your name. His name was Reek. He had to remember that. Reek. Reek, it rhymes with leak. Ned Stark's sons are all dead, Reek thought. Robb was murdered at the Twins, and Bran and Rickon. We dipped their heads in tar. His own head was pounding. He did not want to think about anything that happened before he knew his name. There were things too hurtful to remember, thoughts almost as painful as Ramsay's flaying knife. Reek could hear no more. Please, my lord, my lady, there's been some mistake. He fell to his knees, trembling like a leaf in a winter storm, tears streaming down his ravaged cheeks. I'm not him. I'm not the Turncloak. He died at Winterfell. My name is Reek. He had to remember his name. It rhymes with freak. So, like Sansa, this is, of course, dissociation. Dissociating from the reality of who he is and from the trauma by just zeroing in on what he's got to do, who he's got to be. But this is different to the kind of dissociation we see from Sansa in King's Landing. Sansa doesn't particularly lose sight of who she is. I mean, to an extent. She takes on board all these ideas everybody else presses, that she's just a silly, airheaded little dove. But that has much more to do with a lack of self-belief and the pressures other people put on her than dissociation, I think. Sansa is
freer to think, more aware she is playing a role, speaking in a rehearsed way. And whilst she reduces all life into very straightforward evil monsters versus beautiful knights mentality, she is under no illusions about Joffrey. She hates him, she knows she hates him, she is even capable in certain ways of defying or tricking Joffrey, such as how she spares Sodontus. Sansa's dissociation has more to do with her own worldview than her identity or her abuser. Whereas Theon isn't really able to dissociate from how awful the world is for him, isn't afforded any kind of escapism or dream the way Sansa can fixate on knights and songs. Theon can only really dissociate from, on one hand, his morality. We see this when he is forced to go to Moat Cailin and convince the Ironborn to surrender to Ramsay. He totally dissociates from the morality here. He is not thinking with concern for these Ironborn at all. And that's not because he's cruel and doesn't care, it's because he is so absorbed by this bigger fear that if he can't make them surrender, Ramsay will make him suffer. And when they do surrender, they are consequently tortured and killed by Ramsay, and Theon pushes that fact from his mind. When he woke, a dog was licking vomit from his beard, and dark clouds were scuttling across the face of a sickle moon. Somewhere in the night, men were screaming. He shoved the dog aside, rolled over, and went back to sleep. These are not actions to rack his own morality over, because he is Reek, and Reek simply exists to serve Ramsay. What he is tasked with doing isn't a concern, only that he serves. So there's that, and yes, obviously dissociating from his identity and his feelings towards Ramsay, and I think a lot of his feelings in general. He thinks as Reek, and if a bit of Theon creeps into that, even within his own mind, he has to shut it down, both for fear Ramsay might see whatever feelings and thoughts are going on inside his head, but also more personally for his own kind of inner sense of safety. The second he is Theon is the second he has to question everything he's doing in being Reek, and everything he did before when he was Theon. Does that make sense? If I'm Theon just playing at being Reek rather than actually Reek, it means I was a noble, proud man who has been pathetically reduced to this. It means I was weak enough to let this happen. It means I have to bear that feeling. It also means I have to think about my actions and have to recognise the incredible rage I might feel towards Ramsay and towards myself. All those kind of hurricane thoughts. Whereas, if I am literally just Reek, if none of that other stuff exists, if who I am now is literally all I was made for, nothing else came before it, then I am spared all of that. As I say, this is dissociation both for the sake of literal survival, but also his own psychic survival.
Oh, and I should add in, if it isn't clear, that's not to say Theon is at all pathetic or weak in being reduced to this by Ramsay. He's not. There is no other option if he wants to survive. However, he may feel weak and pathetic and humiliated about it. I tend to hope that kind of point is obvious in what I say in these kind of videos, but I know one of the downsides to the ever so slightly rambling approach I have to these is that I can sometimes say something a bit off the cuff that makes sense to me, but then gives the wrong impression to you in the comments. That does happen from time to time.
But I also said Theon exhibits the trauma response freeze, which we do see a bit of with Sansa, though her go-to is more flop. Those two are often confused, freeze and flop, sometimes defined as the same trauma response, but I think there is a difference, and increasingly people are recognising the distinctions. The best way to explain it, I think, is to imagine a deer caught in headlights. It will totally freeze up, muscles clench, eyes wide. And you know these kind of moments in your own life where you sort of freeze up and you can almost hear the blood pound through your brain, that kind of total alert shock. That's freeze. I'm not actually sure why deer do this in headlights. I would guess it's the hope they're not seen, that maybe a deer in the wild, if it's like suddenly caught out in moonlight or firelight or something, that it will be harder to spot if it stays still. If it tries running or it tries dropping, the predator is likely to chase it. Its movement might attract attention, it might incite the chase. I would guess that's why it remains totally still, but also totally alert in case it does suddenly need to bolt or spring into a different kind of action. It is still, but also kind of poised while it assesses. So that's freeze, but then think of an animal playing dead. In both these examples, they both go very still, but it's kind of the opposite stillness. Muscles here all relax, it's not alert. Sometimes animals in this state completely pass out. Predators like wolves need the I don't know what you call it, the thrill of the hunt. They hunt live prey, and so an animal that appears to already be dead, they go off it. So this animal can pass out, seem completely dead, gets left alone, and only wakes up a bit later on. Not that all flop is literally passing out, that's the extreme, but you kind of get the difference, I think, between the two. So apply that contrast to humans, such as Sansa and Theon. Sansa, of course, does freeze, but she also often goes quite numb to all feeling, loses focus, memories blur and fade, loses time lying in bed or sitting staring out of the window, kind of shut down into a more sleepy state. Whereas Theon, I expect, does to all of that at points. To an extent you can dissociate from pain. I imagine he was also in a flop state a lot of the time. He was left on his own for days and days, weeks, however long, in the dark of a cell. But from what we see of Ramsay when he is brought out of that cell, much more he's hyper alert all the time to what Ramsay is thinking, feeling, if he's going to want something, if he's going to go for me, if anyone else will want something, if I need to be prepared to respond or keep my head down or something. Am I alone? Is someone going to approach here? Is there something happening in the world that's going to affect Ramsay's mood? There's no space for sleepiness and no place to numb his fear because he needs to be prepared for every next danger. Reek was the only man in the hall who did not watch the three dogs fight. He kept his eyes on Ramsay Bolton. One wrong word, an ill-considered look, an ill-timed laugh, any of them could provoke his lordship's wrath and cost a man a strip of skin. There's an entire section at Winterfell where Theon just does not sleep, does not stop. He is constantly walking the grounds, constantly making sure he is away from other people, he is on the move. That's not literally staying still, and in a lot of ways you could say this is flight, but I think this is a form of freeze as well. So yeah, if this section in the book has all been about survival, what happens when Theon does start to re-emerge out of that? So, a lot of different things start to change for Theon. I'm going to try and name most of them, but it's possible there's some I don't, because, you know, there's always more factors to something than you can think. In general, stuff I miss, please do leave in the comments. Even a video as massive as this, there is always things I'm going to miss in general. Either because I didn't notice, or sometimes I just forget to say. It's so hard to try to compile all of my thoughts into a video. Nonetheless, let's try and map out some of the things that help him change. The fact he is tasked with getting the Ironborn at Moat Cailin to surrender is an obvious first one. It means dressing as Theon, talking and behaving as Theon again. And whilst he's terribly afraid the entire time doing that, dissociating from the morality and constantly reminding himself, no, you are not Theon, you are just pretending to be Theon, you are Reek. Despite that, you do see him able to exert some authority, some persuasion, a little bit of humour even. Where is he? Take me to him. Who will keep the door then? Him. Reek gave the corpse a kick. That made the man laugh. Aye, why not? Come with me then. When he then comes across the ill and dying man in charge of Moat Cailin, named something, I think Rafe something or other, he's incredibly ill. Theon tells the guards to put him down. You'd put a dying horse down. What horse? I never had no horse. I did. The memory came back in a rush. Smiler's screams had sounded almost human. His mane afire. He had reared up onto his hind legs, blind with pain, lashing out with his hooves. No, not mine. He was not mine. Reek never had a horse. I will kill him for you. Reek snatched up Ralph Kenning's sword, where it leaned against his shield. That's his name, Ralph Kenning. I was kind of close. Theon is able to be decisive, authoritative, and even if he keeps pushing down all of his thoughts and memories here, they are cropping up. Going to Moat Cailin, where he had previously travelled with Robb, dressed as Theon, stirs up a lot within him. Then, as a reward for this, Theon is elevated to life as a dog. He is given a collar and allowed to sleep in the dog kennels, free to try and fight for meat where they are fed most of the time, which is still awful, obviously, but it is a slightly more stable position, we can say, and it is company. Theon comes to get on really well with these dogs. The dogs were on him before he could puzzle out which, drawn to his scent. The dogs were fond of Reek. He slept with them, oft as not, and sometimes Ben Bones let him share their supper. Before the company of these dogs, when was the last time anyone felt anything positive towards Reek? They afford him some modicum of affection, and similarly, now Reek has relative freedom to roam the grounds, and at least some of the time he is able to communicate with other people again. Something he's understandably reticent to do. It does not feel safe talking to others. It is better to remain hidden as much as possible. To keep his head down, either he is at risk of being drawn attention to, which might mean Ramsay. As I said, when we get to Winterfell, he is constantly roaming the grounds, totally sleep deprived, and one reason for that is because it's safer. If he's out there roaming about in the cold where nobody else wants to go, there's less chance of anyone baiting or tormenting him. But anyway, we can assume he does occasionally talk to some people, because we get one example of an exchange with Big Walder, who, whilst Big Walder is not kind or friendly towards Theon, he will talk ordinarily to him when they're alone. "Who was he?" he said softly, so the other stable hands would not hear. "No one." Big Walder pulled the saddle off his grey. "An old man we met on the road is all. He was driving an old nanny goat and 4 kids. If nothing else, moments like this are reminders Theon is human, and tiny experiences where he can express something of his own free will. And I think Jane appearing is the next obvious change. Sansa's close friend Jane Poole, who disappeared in book 1 when Littlefinger claimed he would look after her, only for Jane to completely vanish and not reappear until now, when she is dressed as Arya Stark. Called Arya Stark, told she is going to marry Ramsay Bolton as a fake Arya Stark to give him more legitimate claim to Winterfell and to the north. Theon, of course, recognises immediately that this is Jane Poole. And to begin with, Theon is afraid to help her. Or, no, that's only half true. Theon thinks he is helping her, and perhaps in some ways he is even correct. When Jane cries and talks of who she really is and talks of trying to escape, Theon shuts all of that down. "Talk like that will get you killed, or worse." That lesson he had learned as Reek. "You are the real Arya, my lady. Arya of House Stark, Lord Eddard's daughter, heir to Winterfell. Her name. She had to know her name. I was never beautiful like Sansa, but they all said I was pretty. Does Lord Ramsay think I am pretty?" "Yes," he lied. "He's told me so. He knows who I am, though. Who I really am. I see it when he looks at me. He looks so angry, even when he smiles, but it's not my fault. They say he likes to hurt people." "My lady should not listen to such lies." "They say he hurt you, your hands, and..." His mouth was dry. I deserved it. I made him angry. You must not make him angry. Lord Ramsay is a sweet man, and kindly. Please him, and he will be good to you. Be a good wife. Just be Arya. Be his wife. Please him, or just please him. And stop this talk about being someone else. Jane. Her name is Jane. It rhymes with pain." Even from the get-go, you can see this conflict here. On the one hand, this has been Theon's defence to just be Reek. Not playing at being Reek, but that's literally who you are. So Jane, likewise, should literally be Arya. In the exact same vein, not only does this kind of talk risk getting her hurt if they're seen or if she fails to act the part convincingly, but becoming Arya is a psychological defence on its own of sorts. Extreme stress often inhibits our ability to think in more complex ways, so in a way it would be simpler to think of nothing but pleasing Ramsay. Simpler than ruminating on your old life, feeling hatred towards him, feeling despair at where you are, trying to have to keep an eye open to seeking escape, everything else. So in a sense, Theon may feel he's doing her a favour. In another sense, I think Theon is very much trying to justify his own decisions and his own behaviour to himself. Not necessarily justifying it to Jane, but if she goes on to make the same decisions he did, then it makes becoming Reek feel more acceptable, you know? He is less alone in that decision. He has someone who can now understand it. But on the other hand, he's not reflecting on what Arya's name rhymes with. He's not making up a refrain for that. thank God, because he'd be hard pressed to find much her name rhymes with. But he's thinking instead what Jane's name rhymes with. He wants to remember who she is really, no matter what he's saying right now. And even if he's not truly ready to want to remember who he himself is, this is definitely a step towards it. Remembering something of his own past in a more indirect way, I suppose. And then they get to Winterfell, and obviously this helps him reclaim a lot of his identity for different reasons. The relative freedom he is now afforded to wander through the halls of his childhood. It's not just the Boltons here now, there are Freys, there are Manderleys, there are Umbers, there are Dustins, all people that make it harder to as directly antagonise Theon. Not that many of these people feel sorry for Theon or feel for him at all, but Ramsay now has to commit a lot of his cruelty in secret, and also it's now much more focused on Jane. So for Theon, this is a bit of space away from torment. Mostly he is just left alone now. Bran also talks to him through the Weird Tree, telling him his name. Theon doesn't realise this is Bran, he thinks it's the old gods whispering, but even so. The increasing awareness, Jane is not safe. Jane can't go on like this. She needs someone to save her. That's obviously much more on his mind, and people like Barbary Dustin also using his actual name and talking to him as a genuine person, or else calling him Turncloak. Being Turncloak is at the least not Reek, you know? And this is actually then what I find most interesting and most insightful about George's writing here, because more than anything else, what's the big thing that enables Theon to become Theon again? It's facing up to what he has done. It is taking accountability, or at the very least beginning to take accountability, beginning to at least find awareness of it. This first chapter at Winterfell is called The Prince of Winterfell, the name Theon gave himself after he took the castle. It is so very fitting that he is now working through all of that again. I said earlier, Reek is partly a very necessary defence to survive his imprisonment under Ramsay, but it is also a defence to spare him facing up to who he is and what he has done, because the person he thought he was, which I think was generally a good person, a bit cocky, a bit flawed, but I reckon Theon mostly believed himself a good, ordinary person. Only somehow his whole life snowballed down this track of committing more and more atrocious acts in a spiral, trying to dig himself out until he could no longer. All he could do was avoid it till now. But who is Theon if he truly did all these horrible things? You can't just avoid or excuse that forever. What does that stuff make him? If he could reclaim his identity, what would it even mean anymore? Maester Luwin's birds. Luwin was dead, and his maester's tower had been put to the torch. Yet the ravens lingered. This is their home. Theon wondered what that would be like, to have a home. I find this line devastating, but it's also poignant. He is remembering Luwin and his own part in his death, and feeling, as a result of everything Theon did, that he doesn't belong here. The voice had been as faint as rustling leaves, as cold as hate. A god's voice, or a ghost's. How many died the day that he took Winterfell? How many more the day he lost it? The day that Theon Greyjoy died to be reborn as Reek. Reek, Reek. It rhymes with shriek. This is Bran whispering his name. Bran, perhaps the most overt symbol for everything Theon did. It is easier to not be Theon, to insist he died, but the world now seems to keep reminding him, haunting him with his past actions, and rather than deflecting that, rather than blocking it, Theon is accepting his part in it and sitting with the real pain of that. Winterfell was full of ghosts for Theon Greyjoy. I made myself the Prince of Winterfell, he thought. And from that came all of this. He had thought that men would sing of him for 100 years and tell tales of his daring. But if anyone spoke of him now, it was Theon Turncloak. And the tales they told were of his treachery. This was never my home. I was a hostage here. Lord Stark had not treated him cruelly, but the long steel shadow of his greatsword had always been between them. He was kind to me, but never warm. He knew that one day he might need to put me to death. I think hidden in that quote is the implication that Eddard should have put him to death. I know I'm labouring the point quite a bit now, but it is moving and therefore worth sitting with. Remember all that time ago when he referred to all these memories and things best not to think about as memories that are almost as painful as Ramsay's flaying knife? I believe he is saying that it was never his home because after everything he did, he doesn't believe he belongs. He believes he never should have belonged. He believes Ned Stark was right to lack warmth and correct to believe he should one day put Theon to death, because after everything he's done, Theon feels that's what he deserves. Even more fittingly, the next chapter is called The Turncloak, as this is now becoming his identity again. He is taking on his actions, the way people see him as a result. He is haunted by thoughts of Bran, of these ghosts in the Winterfell crypts who might strike him down for his betrayal, which is another touch I love, by the way. When Theon comes across the mysterious hooded man, he has no fear of death or punishment, but the idea of the Stark ancestors coming to punish him, that's the terror. That's the Starks, you know? And when this chapter is fittingly called A Ghost in Winterfell, it isn't now about what other Northmen think. It isn't about the Manderleys thinking him a Turncloak, or the Umbers, or whoever else, because it is a much more personal transgression towards the Starks and towards this family he almost had. That being the real issue, rather than the wider world, half political, social branding as the Turncloak. So accepting Turncloak is one thing, but then moving on to being this ghost in Winterfell himself. That's interesting, because in a sense that means he does kind of belong here. At least specifically as a memory, I suppose, as a symbol for the Starks, a reminder for the Starks. A last lone voice that can recall them and what Winterfell used to be, but also carry the pain of everything that happened here under his watch. Really, really sit with that pain, really go over it in his mind. That's what this ghost is now, a kind of representation for all of that. I think in a very strange and tragic way, this is Theon attempting to honour them, and also probably to grieve. Not to seek redemption or forgiveness or resolve anything, simply to carry the hurt, to be with it. I think that is what's so powerful about the metaphor of Theon just constantly roaming the grounds without sleep, like a ghost trapped in a past pain, eternally brooding and reliving it. And he could get stuck in this stage. It's not an easy position at all, but opening himself up to be able to sit with that pain, to recognise his actions, could also then allowed Theon to do something kind of magical, which we will talk about in a second. Firstly, I want to discuss some of the more varied and complex points about Theon's time in Winterfell. Here's the first point: how hard it has been for Theon to feel control over his own thoughts. There is a pervading sense Ramsay is capable of seeing into his mind. This is how utterly broken down Theon was by Ramsay, and it's awful that even as he is becoming Theon again, he still has moments like this. Please, my lord, don't look this way. One glance would be all it would take for Ramsay to know everything. He'll see it written on my face. He'll know. He always knows. Part of this long process has been Theon becoming better able to think freely again, let alone whether he acts on that or not at the time. As a second point, I think is worth highlighting the fact Jane isn't a highborn key political figure. Well, I mean, I suppose she's technically highborn, there is a pooled coat of arms, but crucially she's not Arya Stark. I'm not sure if any of her family survive. Abel and the others carry out their rescue mission because they think she's Arya Stark. Theon hides the fact she's not Arya Stark from them. He wants to rescue her regardless of if she has any political importance or not, simply because she is a girl suffering in much the same way as him. I think that's really important in this book, and actually, Theon is very gentle with her. We'll take you to him, but you must come at once. Jane pulled her wolf skins up to her chin. No, this is some trick. It's him. It's my lord. My sweet lord. He sent you. This is just some test to make sure that I love him. I do. I love him more than anything. A tear ran down her cheek. Tell him. You tell him. I'll do what he wants. Whatever he wants. With him, or with the dog, or... Please. He doesn't need to cut my feet off. I won't try to run away. Not ever. I'll give him sons. I swear it. I'll swear it. In response to this, the other women, Holly and Willow, are not empathetic here. Get her up, Turncloak. Holly had a knife in hand. Get her up or I will. We have to go. Get the little up on her feet and shake some courage into her. It is only Theon who instead attempts to soothe her. Her eyes are the wrong colour, and there are no heroes here, only whores. Even so, he knelt beside her, pulled down the furs, touched her cheek. You know me. I'm Theon, you remember? I know you too. I know your name. And a bit later on, now, we are going out and down the steps, Theon told the girl. Keep your head down and your hood up. Follow Holly. Don't run, don't cry, don't speak, don't look anyone in the eye. Stay close to me, Jane said. Don't leave me. I will be right beside you, Theon promised. Now, is this to say Theon's views of women have magically transformed into something less warped? No. And I want to emphasise this in general because people too often glorify the idea of teaching someone a lesson. You sometimes get people who think Ramsay's torture, while that wasn't its purpose, helped Theon grow, helped him shed his cockiness and his arrogance in place of finding empathy and care, and I think that's such a terrible take. Ramsay's torture did nothing at all to help Theon. It was traumatic beyond belief, and whilst we can always grow, I am a huge believer of growth in spite of all manner of worldly horrors. Whilst we can grow, it is your triumph if you find positives to cultivate out of your pain. Your strength, like taking the rubble of a broken house and being able to build it into something new. That is a great thing, but let us not pretend dropping a bomb on that house was ever good. In general, Theon's attitude towards women does not change. We still see hints of him sexualizing and objectifying the washerwomen, for example. He wanted to hit her, to smash that mocking smile off her face. He wanted to kiss her, to fuck her right here on the table and make her cry his name. But he knew he dare not touch her, in anger or in lust. Holly the whore, he thought. But she was pretty enough. Once he might have laughed and pulled her into his lap. But that day was done. In many ways this is worse, because this is much more a fantasy of power and violence now. I think a lot of this may hint some of what was done to Theon by Ramsay. But a lot of those same thoughts are still in there, and generally that's because shaming someone rarely changes them substantially, and even can exacerbate things. Theon's views and desires have not changed. At least in terms of this. I mean, obviously he's changed in other ways, but in terms of this is Theon's ability to act on those feelings. Either from his general lack of power, the danger it would risk, perhaps revulsion at himself, perhaps physical difficulties. We should probably mention the common theory that Theon has been gelded, had his penis removed. And the evidence for this is that it's what happens in the show, as well as some hints in the books. The many occasions Ramsay tells Theon he is not a man, or Theon tells himself he is not a man. For someone who so fixedly defined his masculinity by his penis and his sexuality, that might suggest the loss of it. There's also this line, he has only taken toes and fingers, and that other thing. And then there's that horrible scene where Ramsay instructs Theon to pleasure Jane, and he at first thinks this means his penis. For a moment he did not understand. Do you mean, my lord, I have no... With your mouth, Lord Ramsay said, and be quick about it. Was Theon about to say, my lord, I have no penis? Look, I'm not going to say this theory is wrong. In a lot of ways, I think this is a very odd thing to be devoting a section of this video to. Personally, I don't think it matters either way. That a man goes through such torture and then so much of the audience spends ages debating and theorising whether or not he has a penis feels kind of tasteless and objectifying in its own way, you know? We can fully understand what Theon's been through and how he feels emotionally and psychologically without needing to know the answer to this question. However, I know I will get a lot of comments about this. I know I will be asked about it, so I decided I will at least address it now and say, whilst it's hardly conclusive, I tend to believe Theon hasn't been gelded. That a large part of Theon's perceived value as a hostage is the idea he could technically produce offspring to carry on his line. I suspect, had he been gelded, Roose Bolton would have been furious with Ramsay, and we may have heard something about that, some of that fury. Instead of saying I have no penis, which if he doesn't, and Theon has refused to ever think this, it would be surprising he would say it out loud, but Theon could easily have been saying something like, my lord, I have no right. Let's not forget he absolutely does not want to be doing this to Jane. It isn't awful scene. There's also the fact it's strange Theon does never speak more plainly about this when he is pretty direct in his descriptions about other torture he suffered. There's the fact in the previous quote, his reasons for not assaulting the washerwomen make no mention of not being physically able to. He only says, but he knew he dare not touch her in anger or in lust. And that other thing Theon hints Ramsay took from him could easily mean his spirits, his belief. Most likely I actually think it means his name, which of course he wouldn't mention directly because that's not him anymore. He's trying to not think Theon. So, you know, if anything, we could theorise instead of gelding, Theon has become impotent. Psychologically, with everything that's gone on, I could totally believe Theon would be impotent right now. It is also somewhat possible he might believe the impotence itself is something Ramsay has literally taken. I don't like talking about this. You know, half the reason I have bothered to theorise at all is because despite how distasteful I find this, I could see some possible merit in Theon's impotence being a plot point. It feels like an experience George might feel worth exploring character-wise. The struggles of impotency for someone who did once define so much of themselves by their sexuality. Impotency is not a theme we've really seen explored in such a sex-heavy set of books. So it's possible, it is something a lot of men struggle with, and handled with sensitivity could be a touching aspect to Theon's story going ahead. Maybe. Where, by contrast, if Theon is gelded, I don't think that would be much meaning to that worth exploring. It also feels like a much more crude metaphor. This boy who wants to find his masculinity through sex has his penis removed, much like Jaime who defined his life by fighting loses his sword hand. It just feels cruder and potentially a less sensitive metaphor. So I decided I would mention that. Anyway, the point was, he has a lot of the same thoughts about women. It would be nice if he's given space to grow there in the next book, but yeah, it's still worth mentioning he is empathetic and caring towards Jane as a human, not an object. At least on a narrative and metaphorical level, it feels like George might be making a contrast there. The fact he is ordered to pleasure Jane and very much does not want to. Maybe you could draw something metaphorical from that if you want to, but personally I just think Theon has never been without compassion, unable to feel care and affection towards women. I don't think this is a change in his character. I think this is a girl he's seen tortured, a girl who has been put through much the same as him. Even more so she is a child. The fact Theon risks so much to help Jane, I think points less to a changing attitude towards women than a renewed courage in general to do the right thing, a renewed morality that he was previously dissociating from. That's what I would conclude. Let's discuss the Hooded Man. So, TV watchers might not know anything about this. One of my favourite chapters from any of the A Song of Ice and Fire books is A Ghost in Winterfell, because apart from being a fascinating snapshot of Theon's state of mind, it is also a murder mystery chapter. People keep winding up dead in the castle, and we have the Boltons here, as they have married the fake Arya to Ramsay, and we have the Freys here as well, and most of the northern houses are here to bear witness. They are all technically planning to also fight Stannis' army, but they're trapped in the castle due to a terrible storm, whilst Stannis is somewhere beyond the walls with his forces, waiting for the chance to fight, basically. And while they're all stuck in this castle, tensions are rising, patience is waning, Freys and Boltons keep turning up dead, nobody knows who is doing it. Theon, who has been roaming the castle grounds endlessly without any sleep at all, is questioned for these murders until they conclude he's basically physically incapable. Theon is able to wield a dagger, as we see at later points, but has he got the strength to do any of these killings? They decide no, and then later in the chapter, Theon appears to bump into the killer, this hooded man who was readying to strike Theon down, and they have this short exchange. Theon Turncloak, Theon Kinslayer. I was Ironborn. False is all you were. How is it you still breathe? The gods are not done with me, Theon answered, wondering if this could be the killer. The Night Walker who had stuffed Yellow Dick's cock into his mouth and pushed Roger Risewell's groom off the battlements. Oddly, he was not afraid. He pulled the glove from his left hand. Lord Ramsay is not done with me. The man looked and laughed. I'll leave you to him then. Now, there are a lot of theories about who this killer is. We're not going to get bogged down discussing all of them. What I am going to do is discuss the one version of this theory that most relates to this video. The theory that Theon is the killer. He has murdered, not all the victims. I think Little Walder was likely murdered by Big Walder, or the other way around if it was Big killed by Little. I can't remember which way around that is. In fact, I've forgotten all of the victims. There might be another one that they suggest somebody else killed, but the theory that Theon at least killed some of them. That is a theory we're going to discuss, and also that this hooded man is a hallucination of Theon's. It is in fact Theon talking to himself. Yeah, both of those points are a common theory, and I thought it was worth discussing whether I believe psychologically this idea is even possible. And basically, yeah, I think it's possible. Not the most likely, but possible. It means 3 things would have to be true. The first is that Theon is physically capable of committing these murders, and I can actually believe that. I think it would be narratively fitting if Theon is actually more capable than he currently realises. It would also be very fitting that all of the others would underestimate him, and that under enough intensity he can outperform whatever would look to be achievable. If he was to murder these people without really knowing, then there would likely have been a lot of intensity to the moment. For God knows how long Theon has had to suppress all of this anger at everything that's happened to him. It is possible this would now be a point in time where it might emerge again, and when so much has been suppressed, those feelings might come out hugely intense. We've already seen him half fantasize about violence towards the washerwomen. I can believe he might be emotionally driven to commit these murders, and also that he might be physically capable, especially if he took them unaware, which would be easy to do when nobody expects Reek to fight. Again, not necessarily likely, but I can believe that possible. Secondly, he would then have to be committing these murders without any memory, which, yeah, again, I think is possible. Not only is he extremely deprived of sleep, but I think complex trauma suggests the possibility of memory gaps. I mean, I've seen people sometimes diagnose Theon with dissociative identity disorder or multiple personalities disorder, and I don't really see that being the most fitting because this isn't long-term. Theon has no history prior to Ramsay. All of the symptoms we might associate that are pretty much mostly happening here under the extreme pain and stress and abuse Ramsay has put him. That's what we see. Prolonged trauma, abuse, identity fragmentation, as a result, loss of agency and autonomy, a sense of Ramsay invading his thoughts, prolonged fear, constant lack of safety. I would point to complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and with that diagnosis, to commit violent acts during dissociative episodes, is possible in my opinion. I'm not going to pretend I'm any expert on these kind of diagnoses. Whether or not someone can commit murder without realising is not the kind of question that comes up in children's psychotherapy very often, you know? I'm not encountering this on a daily basis. Anyway, I do think it's possible there is a part of Theon ready to express and expel a lot of these very intense, unbearably palpable emotions, only he has never been able to express them healthily or to a degree he can manage and can consciously regulate. And if that's true, they might come out more as bodily actions here. Rage and terror expelled through action, through physicality that the rest of his brain is not yet able to recognise or consciously think about because the emotions behind it are too intense. That kind of theory makes some sense to me, and I think this may sound paradoxical, that Theon would dissociate as extremely as this at a time he is also beginning to rediscover his identity as Theon. But I think it does perhaps make some sense. That's the more he's integrated his identity, the more a lot of totally suppressed emotions might rise to the surface. And as I say, we can only imagine how much intense emotion Theon has about his torture. What we also know is the freeze and friend trauma responses aren't quite so effective in this new environment at Winterfell. We are still seeing both of them, but also fights and flight are beginning to emerge now as possible options. And all this emotion is still there, even if it was buried for a long time. If some of it is starting to surface, it might be far too intense for Theon to consciously feel, and so dissociation may spike in moments where it does surface, which could cause him not to remember. The more Theon is able to become himself, to feel freely, the more he may at first lose control. And I think, again, paradoxically, the more he may then ping back and forth between different aspects of identity. He is in a weird flux between being Reek and being Theon, with neither yet really integrated into a central identity, so he much more bounce from extremes between them. Does this make sense? I feel like I'm not explaining it very well. The point is, it's possible. The third point, though, Theon would have to be hallucinating the hooded man, which, yeah, is also possible for many of the same reasons. Hallucinations being brought on by the extreme conditions he's under, by perhaps being sleep deprived. As far as we know, we've seen no other hallucinations, which does make me wonder, but again, I don't think we can rule this out. I think people who rule this theory out as ridiculous, I don't think that's fair to do so, but I also don't know if this theory is the most likely option. However, narratively, there are some parallels. Remember last time Theon was at Winterfell when he and Reek secretly murdered a lot of guards, and Theon's trail of thought was very careful not to allude to it clearly, to never consciously sit with that. Yeah, that happened, and so now for Theon, who is also currently Reek, to be having a similar thing happening again, now he is back at Winterfell, makes for a nice narrative parallel. And then that Theon might hallucinate this hooded spectre of himself who has come to kill him, only to change his mind, also makes a lot of thematic sense. Because we've seen Theon sort of do this a lot. Contemplate killing himself only to change his mind, or also, as some of the following quotes will suggest, hoping someone else will kill him. It makes no matter. A quick death here would be 100 times better than returning to Lord Ramsay as a failure. Unless the gods were good, and Stannis Baratheon descended on Winterfell and put all of them to the sword, himself included, that was the best he could hope for. Shout out your name before them all. Tell them you are not Arya Stark. Let all the North hear how you were made to play this part. It would mean her death, of course, and his own as well, but Ramsay in his wrath might kill them quickly. The old gods of the North might grant them that small boon. I have no way to save her, he thought, but I could kill her easy enough. No one would expect it. I could beg her for the honour of a dance and cut her throat. That would be a kindness, wouldn't it? And if the old gods hear my prayer, Ramsay in his wrath might strike me dead as well. Theon was not afraid to die. Underneath the Dreadfort, he had learned there were far worse things than death. I could jump, he thought. He lived, why shouldn't I? He could jump and what? Break a leg and die beneath the snow? Creep away to freeze to death? It was madness. Ramsay would hunt him down with the girls. Red Jane and Jez and Helicent would tear him to pieces if the gods were good. Or worse, he might be taken back alive. I have to remember my name, he whispered. Theon wondered if he might be allowed to fight. Then at least he might die a man's death, sword in hand. That was a gift Ramsay would never give him, but Lord Roose might. If I beg him, I did all he asked of me, I played my part, I gave the girl away. Death was the sweetest deliverance he could hope for. These kind of quotes leave you wondering, why has he never attempted it? There is a part of here very clearly wanting death, or at least wanting an end to his current situation, and death being the only obvious option available, and very clearly not afraid of death. So why has he not tried it? Is it just the fear that if he fails, Ramsay will punish him for the attempt? To be honest, I don't think we can answer this question convincingly, because Theon never gives any explanation, but I would guess it's because he doesn't feel he deserves the release. He doesn't think that's his decision to make. He is haunted by what he did to the Starks, and I think there's some poor self-loathing part of him that feels he's supposed to suffer. And if a day comes where he has suffered enough, has atoned enough, then the world will deliver him from that pain. But it's not his choice to make now. Does that make sense? An awful, incorrect, but understandable part of him that now looks at how he ended up here and wonders, maybe I deserve this. Maybe this was supposed to happen to me after what I did. It would then also make sense as to why Theon is surprisingly interested in the Stark old gods, despite never worshipping them himself, despite not being particularly religious at all. He talks about the old gods a lot, and for how they relate to the Starks. I think they'd be a perfect symbol for this otherworld sense of fate that will decide when and if Theon has suffered enough. But in the context of all of this, that's a hallucination of Theon himself should walk up to him, ready to kill him, and ask, how are you still alive? Why aren't you dead? Suddenly, that question is very fitting, as is Theon's answer, to reveal the missing fingers under his glove and say, Ramsay is not done with me, or effectively the gods are not done with me. Is it not really about what Ramsay feels? Is it just that Theon feels he must suffer more, and that the gods giving him to Ramsay is just the method for that? Maybe. I think this theory does fit together quite well. But basically I'm going to leave that for all of you to discuss. If you are familiar with this theory, then you don't need me to explain all the other arguments behind it, because obviously there is more than I've said out. I was just kind of suggesting it's possible. There is a bigger point I'd like to move on to now, which is what if Theon is living on not just because he deserves suffering, not just because he must wait to earn his death, but because in living he can seek to do something more. Do you remember me talking about accountability all that time ago? I said being able to accept what he did, being able to recognise it and recognise the consequences that followed was an important step for Theon to become Theon again. Well, one of the reasons people tend not to take accountability is, of course, defensiveness, that it hurts to be deemed responsible for something bad, sometimes shamed for it, sometimes branded a bad person overall. That thought is so uncomfortable that we have to deflect responsibility. But doing that means you never really get to grow. In never first accepting your own past actions, how can you truly believe you can grow beyond them, can become capable of so much better? For example, what would be the point in Theon becoming Theon again? If Theon was such a bad, horrible person who betrayed his closest friends and family, tried to kill some of them, potentially killed his own children. If that's who Theon is, why the hell would he want to be that guy again? Reek may be seen as pathetic, but at least he's forced to do the bad he does. At least he's not directly his fault. At least he's not expected to know better. And I think there are quite a few reasons worth becoming Theon again, but one of the big ones being if you believed that guy is capable of actually doing good, and yet you can't really believe that if you don't first face up to the bad that you did do. Does that make sense? Otherwise, it's not true belief. It's not like looking at the worst of yourself and knowing it doesn't have to define you. It would instead be like refusing to look at the worst of yourself for fear that it might define you. It is very much worth being Theon again if you conclude there is more you can do other than just suffer, that suffering isn't enough, perhaps isn't even relevant. I mean, what if it's not that Ramsay isn't yet done with you? It's that what Ramsay is doing is besides the point. No amount of cruelty will absolve you of your sins, nor satisfy the old gods or the Starks in the crypt, because Ramsay's cruelty has nothing to do with it. He is not divine punishment. He is simply an awful, horrible man. And I think the more Theon is afforded space to think freely, the more he can start to recognise that, can start to look at Ramsay beyond the ways he's supposed to look at him. Absolution, or even just growth, is to do with you personally. What's inside of you, not what the external does to you. The only reason, and the only possible way Theon can truly become Theon again is if he embarks on that kind of journey, and where it leads is to rediscovering agency, feeling empowered, perhaps even feeling more positive. Regardless of whether or not he's made amends, earned redemption, that's not the point. The point is simply that he can do something good now in the present. He can keep doing good things. That's all any of us can ever do. And if you can do that, then I think it's worth living. Principally, the good thing he can do in this moment is try to save Jane Poole. Saving Jane Poole is not about Theon hoping he can do something that will redeem him. It is about simply saving someone who needs saving, and Theon becoming someone again that is worth living. As part of their escape, they are confronted by guards who call out, "Reek, is that you?" "Yes," he meant to say. Instead, he heard himself reply, "Theon Greyjoy." So, as much as the last chapter was called Growth, you may have noticed we haven't really discussed much actual growth we've seen in Theon. And that's because we kind of don't get the space to see it. We see him grow to the position where he's able to escape Ramsay, he's able to shed the identity Reek and become Theon again, but we don't see much beyond that. We don't really know what makes this Theon now different to the Theon when he was 19. All we've got is one Winds of Winter chapter. All I will say is we get to see Theon's smile again, and laugh again, and make jokes again, sometimes mocking Stannis, and I think less so from a position of insecurity this time, and needing to belittle them in order to build up himself, and more just, I don't really know what the motivation is, other than the fun of it, to actually find some level of joy again within all of the pain he suffered. I think there is something kind of positive in there. This man whose horse named Smiler was burned to death, to see him smile again. There is a moment near the start of this sample chapter that kind of breaks my heart, because escaping Ramsay, he and Jane encounter Stannis' men. Stannis, who also has Theon's sister Usha captive at the moment. It means Theon and his sister reunite. That was in fact how Usha's final chapter in A Dance with Dragons ended. It showed us the beginning of their reunion. He raised his eyes. "Sister, see? This time I knew you." Usha doesn't recognise him at first because of how physically different he is, and she recoils a bit before realising. His lips skinned back in what might have been a grin. Half his teeth were gone, and half of those still left him were broken and splintered. "Theon," he repeated. "My name is Theon. You have to know your name."
It's worth remembering Theon has fought all of this time, not just to be free of Ramsay, not just to save Jane, but to be Theon again. And the fact it now places him in the north with an army primed to fight in the memory of the Starks, also with his Greyjoy sister there, in some ways feels like this could finally be the merging of the two different identities, two different families within Theon that he always wanted to achieve. And realistically, I don't know how absolutely that might happen in that more kind of external sense there, but it's still a beautiful thought. Theon can mean both Stark and Greyjoy without those two parts being at war. This has in a lot of ways been his constant battle. How can my sense of identity integrate both parts? And when you look at the reasons he's been unable to do this before, much more than the fact the Greyjoys seem opposed to the Starks, the problem has been Theon's desire for approval, Theon's need for that validation, rather than Theon's security to be making his own decisions and being his own person. The best way for Theon to integrate both Greyjoy and Stark would be to focus much more on the kind of person he wants to be, rather than on the kind of person he feels other people want him to be, or the kind of person that represents those two parts. Rather than how can I work for what those two houses are, how can those two houses suit for who I am, and how can they work for me, you know? But in general, this is just such a relatable struggle for someone ordinarily to be going through around late teens, early 20s. You're at that age where you are very much discovering independence, very much breaking out of both childhood and adolescence to be an independent man, full of ideas and ambitions, but not necessarily the sense of direction yet, not really anything to show for yourself. For which Theon was obsessed with ideas both of glory and of approval, partly as this sense of validation. But chasing glory contributed to ripping his entire life apart, and when he's then had to spend ages not thinking at all about what he wants to do or who he wants to be, having to think solely about what Ramsay wants him to be, everything else was suppressed until saving Jane became a real moment of making his own decision and doing something not driven by what others will think of him or how others will react. That's also why it's important he's saving someone who doesn't have much political weight, you know? It's not for those reasons. He's simply doing what he thinks is the right thing and the right way to live. And so, if Theon is going to go anywhere, this surely has to be it. I'm hoping to see Theon increasingly become someone who will make his own decisions regardless of what people think. And the point of glory, I suppose, is that it feels totally gone for Theon now. He's now seen as the Turncloak and this fool Greyjoy who doomed himself at Winterfell, as the Ironborn might see it. You know, this social branding is not a good thing, but to an extent it also might start to feel liberating to Theon, to now not have to worry about proving his worth all the time, to realise how he feels within is so much more important, above ideas of glory. Theon is his own unique person. He doesn't have to be one of the Starks, he doesn't have to be one of the Greyjoys, he can be who he is, independent from that as well. The fact he's torn between both families doesn't have to be what's wrong with him, that can also be what's special. That's largely the loose conjecture I would say about Theon's character going ahead. So that's what I hope to see. I mean, I don't actually know on a concrete level what happens with Theon in the Winds of Winter. He may even die, but if he does die, I'm hoping he gets to do so feeling like a whole complete person with a free mind, rather than a fragmented person whose inner thoughts are dominated by other people.
But I was saying I found their reunion heartbreaking, wasn't I? It's this quote from the Winds of Winter sample chapter. Instead of rushing forward to embrace him, she had taken half a step backwards. "Did the bastard do this to you?" she had asked. "Don't call him that." Then the words came spilling out of Theon in a rush. He tried to tell her all of it, about Reek and the Dreadfort, and Kyra and the Keys. How Lord Ramsay never took anything but skin unless you begged for it. He told her how he'd saved the girl, leaping from the castle wall into the snow. "We flew. Let Abel make a song of that, we flew." Then he had to say who Abel was, and talk about the washerwomen who weren't truly washerwomen. By then, Theon knew how strange and incoherent all of this sounded, yet somehow the words would not stop. He was cold and sick and tired and weak. So weak, so very weak. "She has to understand. She is my sister." He never wanted to do any harm to Bran or Rickon. Reek made him kill those boys. Not him, Reek, but the other one. "I am no kinslayer," he insisted. He told her how he'd bedded down with Ramsay's bitches, warned her that Winterfell was full of ghosts. "The swords were gone. 4, I think, or 5. I don't recall. The Stone Kings are angry." He was shaking by then, trembling like an autumn leaf. "The Heart Tree knew my name. The old gods. Theon, I heard them whisper. There was no wind, but the leaves were moving. Theon, they said. My name is Theon." It's just to imagine how mad this all must have sounded to Usher. It all makes complete sense to Theon. This is all totally rational, but everything he has held back for so long that consciously expressing himself here is like a dam bursting and feels almost mythic with these vivid symbols that mark aspects of his story, like Kyra and the Keys, Ramsay's bitches, the swords that were gone, the leaves were whispering. This is great, seeing him able to talk through everything that happened in a way that is coherent to him, but you can just imagine Usher's reaction to this. Look, to finish this video, I have one theory about Theon going ahead, and I also have one question to raise, or maybe 2, I don't know. But the theory first. It begins with wondering, what can Theon even realistically do in the books now? Because the idea he goes into battle and gets to die a somewhat glorious death just rings hollow to me. He is physically capable of fighting, but I doubt very effectively. Don't get me wrong, I think him probably capable of murdering someone he catches unaware, but charging in to fight a ton of people is very different. And this is like what the younger Theon hoped for. When he realises how badly his capture of Winterfell will end, he thinks, if I die friendless and abandoned. What choice did that leave him but to live?
He would accept death if it had come with that ironborn glaze of a glorious end, dying in battle with your people. He later thinks he should have been with Robb for that exact end, but that's never been the end Theon has been given, because I think it is not the right one. We are moving past ideas of glory, surely, and Theon's life is not about how it ends, not about a fitting final moment worthy of memory. It is about what he can do now with the strength he still has, in my opinion. So the idea of him being allowed to charge into battle with Stannis and die somewhere against the Boltons feels kind of hollow. Not that I'm opposed to him fighting the Boltons, especially if it's to reclaim Winterfell. I mean, that might feel like righting some of his wrongs on one level, but just dying in the battle or just going in as an ordinary soldier there feels hollow, and again, that's not where his strength truly lies. Theon was always good at 2 things. One was archery, and that ability we know has sadly been taken from him now. He is no longer capable of firing a bow well, but his other strength was his wits. His cunning, his tactical nous. I'll say it again, his capture of Winterfell was tactically very clever, even if it was politically foolish. And I don't think he's not politically astute exactly. You know, in the same way I think Catelyn Stark is politically astute, yet there are obvious moments where her emotions cloud her judgment. Theon's judgment was clouded in taking Winterfell by his desire to merge 2 identities, then clouded again when he was desperate not to let it go. But we do see him often
in his internal thoughts, effectively analysing the politics behind Roose and Ramsay's actions, what they will do next, how they will react to events. He is quite good at that. He is also able to effectively answer all of Stannis' questions. He is also generally quite a witty person, even if he is actually very easy to insult and easily swayed by others, at least the young Theon was. I don't know if he'll be like that now, but he's still witty, and he is also a very effective liar, as we saw in convincing the Ironborn to surrender at Moat Cailin, as we saw even in convincingly lying that he killed Bran and Rickon. Generally, being the Prince of Winterfell under Ramsay, being this person marrying Jane Paul to Ramsay, required a level of deception, and we see him deceiving many of the Bolton guards during his rescue of Jane. "Where's Maisie and Jez and the other girls?" one asked Theon. "The usual ones." "Lady Arya was displeased with them," he lied. "Her water was cold before it reached the tub last time." "She had a bath last night. How dirty can one woman get in her own bed?" "Dirtier than you know when you share that bed with Ramsay," Theon thought, remembering the wedding night and the things he and Jane had been made to do. Lord Ramsay's command. To lie effectively, knowing how incredibly afraid Theon is in this situation, to know what defying Ramsay means to him, that is huge. I think of two quotes. One from that chapter where they do work to rescue Jane. Rowan grabbed him by the throat and shoved him back against the barracks wall, her face an inch from his. "Say it again, and I'll rip out your tongue, Kinslayer." He smiled through his broken teeth. "You won't. You need my tongue to get past the guards. You need my lies." Right now, Theon's tongue is his weapon, not bows or daggers. I also think back to this in his first chapter as Reek. "He can take my fingers and my toes. He can put out my eyes and slice my ears off. But he cannot take my wits unless I let him." I think if Theon is going to do anything in the next book, which surely it's not narratively very satisfying if he does nothing at all, if he does anything, it will involve wit and cunning and probably a level of deception. Those are his weapons now, and as negative as those traits can be, also not necessarily. His deception to rescue Jane, for example, is a good thing. The fact they do then go on still pretending Jane is Arya, that's not great, and it's not at all what Jane wants, but it is also probably a good thing to keep her safe until someone with a modicum of power who does actually know and care about Jane might be able to protect her. Maybe Jon Snow or Sansa. I hope she meets Sansa and tells her all about Littlefinger. But I'm sure whatever Theon does will be along those lines. And it is for this reason I believe Theon is the one behind the pink letter. If you're unaware, in the books Jon Snow receives this weird letter while he's Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, supposedly from Ramsay Bolton, and this is what prompts Jon to forgo his duties at the Night Watch and ride out to help fight and defeat Ramsay. The letter is as follows. "Your false king is dead, bastard. He and all his host were smashed in 7 days of battle. I have his magic sword. Tell his red whore, your false king's friends are dead. Their heads upon the walls of Winterfell. Come see them, bastard. Your false king lied, and so did you. You told the world you burned the king beyond the wall. Instead, you sent him to Winterfell to steal my bride from me. I will have my bride back. If you want Mance Rayder back, come and get him. I have him in a cage for all the North to see, proof of your lies. The cage is cold, but I have made him a warm cloak from the skins of the 6 whores who came with him to Winterfell. I want my bride back. I want the false king's queen. I want his daughter and his red witch. I want his wildling princess. I want his little prince, the wildling babe. And I want my Reek. Send them to me, bastard, and I will not trouble you or your black crows. Keep them from me, and I will cut out your bastard's heart and eat it." It was signed Ramsay Bolton, Trueborn, Lord of Winterfell. Now, there are a lot of potential candidates who have written this letter. Mance Rayder, Ramsay himself, Wyman Manderley, Stannis, whoever else I'm forgetting that people theorise. There are a lot of inconsistencies that don't quite add up with Ramsay, and there is good arguments for any of these characters being behind it. There is obviously more logic to suggest Theon. If you're interested, I'll link a good video from Quinn The GM down below who talks about it in a lot more detail, but I add my singular extra arguments to the theory that it's Theon. The arguments that narratively you want your point of view character to be able to do something fulfilling, and this behaviour fits well with the character strengths Theon has available to him. It requires wit and courage, it requires knowledge of Ramsay turned now against him, which would also thematically be a fitting thing for Theon to do, and also knowledge of Jon Snow. And then secondary motives. It makes sense Theon might want Jon to come to Stannis, because Jon will then see Jane Paul, Jon might be able to protect her, and also because Theon himself may want a Stark he can properly answer to for his betrayal. So there's my 3 theories for you this video. Theon has not been gelded, Theon at least potentially could have committed the murders and could be the Hooded Man, and Theon wrote the pink letter. There are no doubt still a lot of things I haven't discussed despite the length of this video. There are gaps I hope some of you can fill, or thoughts of mine you can question and rework. But the question I want to ask is, where does Bran come into this? Bran, it seems, both through the Weirwood Tree and through the Ravens in the Winds of Winter sample chapter, keeps speaking Theon's name. If Bran was first doing that to make him reclaim the name Theon and accept his past actions, or to be cold and scolding towards Theon, maybe, but I don't see why Bran would keep calling Theon after he reaches Stannis, unless there was something more Bran is hoping he can do. And I ask, what do you think that is? Where does Theon's increasing interest in the old gods fit? Where does this lingering fear about the Starks in the crypts come into it? Just generally, what do you think happens next to Theon? Look, this has been a long video and I've now gotten really tired, so I'm not going to attempt to wrap this up with a short talk about how Theon's story is a great exploration of someone struggling to understand what it means to be a man in a world that has very set ideas on that topic that don't always add up with reality. I suppose me just saying that sums it up well enough. If you like this video or my many other videos like it, please give it a like, but not just subscribe, because increasingly subscribing doesn't work. YouTube just does not consistently promote any of my videos to my subscribers, even if they've clicked the bell. It's supposed to do that, it does not. So if you want to properly stay in the loop about my videos, consider joining my Patreon, even if it's just as a free member. I make posts sharing all my new YouTube videos there, so it's a great way to be consistently notified about all my new releases. And if you want the extra benefits, such as bonus content, your name in the credits, access to our Discord server, or you just want to help keep this channel sustainable, consider a paid membership. But yeah, otherwise please join as a free member, because it helps my videos pick up better in the algorithm when obviously there's more people able to watch them due to them being promoted elsewhere. But yeah, let me know what you think of the video of Theon, comment your thoughts, good or bad, and otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Flying Spider, Luke Hoare, Michael Gallagher, Ben Marie, Thafy, Chad Bramwell, and Joshua C. Follier. Thank you.